Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto saves Rias from Rise from starting part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Naruto knelt before the small stone monument, his fingers tracing across the etched words. His mind was elsewhere, remembering and reminiscing. Normally he would speak a few words, silly as he usually felt while doing so, but today he wasn't alone, and so they remained in the privacy of his own mind. He took his time nonetheless, not letting that fact bother him. Minutes passed like that, the man behind him simply waiting a respectful distance away. Finally Naruto exhaled a deep, shuddering breath, letting go of the emotions that had wandered to the forefront of his mind. He did not often feel his true age, time leaving no trace on his body as it passed him by. Except for his white hair, he was in his prime physically, but there were always moments like these when the memories overwhelmed him. Standing up he gave the stone one last look before turning around. What could be so important that you would come here just to deliver a job to me? Normally I deal with some kind of middleman, Naruto said, breaking the silence. The blonde man was clad in a simple robe, his stance prepared but relaxed. Though the wings were currently hidden he knew of their existence. Call it a passing interest, if you want. You are not an easy man to find by any means. The man still remained at a distance, but whether that was a sign of respect or caution was difficult to say. Passing interest or not, shouldn't you be preoccupied with other, more pressing, issues? Naruto asked, tilting his head slightly. I must admit you do have me at a disadvantage. I'm convinced you know exactly who I am, and yet I know only of your reputation, the angel forged on, ignoring Naruto's comment entirely. I assumed Azazel would have told you, it's not actually much of a secret. He tended to choose his acquaintances carefully, but he had never made much of a deal out of staying unknown. Naruto had met Azazel shortly after he fell, and the leader of the Grigori knew his name. There wasn't much sense he could find in him not telling his subordinates, though perhaps Azazel was once more behaving like the man-child he really was deep down. Azazel didn't deem it necessary for me to know beforehand, since I was planning to meet you anyway. Despite the professional airs he tried to put on, the man was clearly not particularly happy about that fact. Even if he had never made the acquaintance himself, Naruto knew exactly who stood across from him. Tamel was a leader of Grigori under Azazel, and he had interacted with the man's subordinates before. Whenever business was concerned, Tamel was involved, though usually not this directly. If you're here I assume Azazel has a job for me. Important too, if he sent you to deliver it. That was as true for humans as it was for every other kind of being. The more important one was, the less likely they were to take care of their problems personally. The gods especially were whimsical. He could attest to that personally. They had no fondness for most other creatures, even if they were more than willing to use them to accomplish their own goals. You are aware of the current events in the underworld? Tamel asked. Naruto immediately understood what he and by extension Azazel expected of him. Tracking these things was essential for his line of work. The brewing civil war. What does Azazel care about it? He said, asking for clarification. Nobody was openly speaking about it yet, even among devils, but it was the only reasonable explanation. Territories being fortified, alliances being renewed or dissolved between the remaining pillars, and the rising tension between what were more and more clearly two separate camps. Exactly. We have a vested interest in an assured outcome. Azazel does not want the possibility of the Great War restarting, Tamel answered. I assume Azazel has an offer for me. His orc especially did not come cheap, but Grigori certainly had the means to pay for it. Instead of answering his question, Tamel simply reached for his robe and pulled out a small wooden chest. We'll pay the usual rate. In addition, Azazel gave me this. The fruits of his latest work, Tamel said and extended the chest towards him. Naruto spared the fallen a considering glance as he stepped forwards, focusing on his extremities, looking for any twitch. The likelihood of betrayal was astronomically low, considering the situation, but he could not help but be on guard. He accepted the chest and stopped himself from stepping back again. The thing wasn't particularly heavy. Lifting the lid made it clear why. Nested inside the fabric lining was a metal circlet on top of pieces of parchment. He ignored the paper for now and picked up the ring. It was light, thin, and barely big enough to fit around his wrist. Turning it in his hand he inspected the symbols etched along the surface. Naruto knew most of them, but deciphering their exact function without further inspection was beyond even his abilities. He was sure that Azazel knew exactly how the object could be valuable to him and that the fallen wasn't trying to trick him into a bad offer. Some individuals had tried that in the past and it hadn't ended well for them. Azazel knew as much. He gave Tamel a questioning glance, wordlessly asking for an explanation. The papers hold an explanation of the functions and limits. Azazel was quite proud when he finished this piece, Tamel said simply. Naruto nodded his head in acceptance. Placing the circlet back inside he skimmed over some of the lines of text. The first page was a short note addressed directly to him, while the others held detailed explanation of the exact uses and limits of the trinket. You can tell Azazel that he doesn't need to concern himself with the devils, it will be taken care of. He paused, Tamel already turning to leave. It's Naruto. Tamel turned his head, confusion evident in his expression before understanding flickered across his face. He gave a brief nod of respect. With a final glance between the two of them, Tamel unfurled his wings and left the area. Naruto followed him with his eyes for a few seconds, already going over the necessary preparations for this mission in his head. A trip back home to Japan was in order. He had spent enough time in France. Ultimately, it hadn't taken long for everything to go to hell in the underworld. Prideful as devils were, they didn't take kindly to disobedience, and that counted double for the descendants of the Satans. After the Bale clan had publicly opposed them, with some of the other pillars backing them up, fights had started to break out all over the underworld. Though some of the pillars had chosen to remain neutral for now, it was only a matter of time before they would also be joining the fray, willing or not. As it stood, both sides of the conflict had the same number of pillar houses backing them. The real difference was that the old Satan faction held the advantage in pure numbers outside of that, which would likely be the factor deciding the outcome in the end. If the sides remained as they were and he didn't intervene, that was. Both sides had a roughly equal number of notably promising individuals, the descendants of 3 of the Satans among them. All in all, they were rather evenly matched for now. How to interfere then? He could directly go after some of the pillar houses, but he would reserve that option for later. For now, information would probably be the best thing to give out. Going to Zekrom would be more difficult than practical, but there were other candidates. It had to be someone in a high enough position to actually put the information to good use, but not so high up that they were powerful enough to make getting away a hassle. Keeping his existence unknown wasn't the problem. Some devils knew him and a bit more knew of him. But being discovered would bring up questions. Questions he wasn't inclined to answer truthfully, and evading questions was always better than lying. His employer's identity had to remain hidden after all. Naruto had just the right pillar in mind already, even if the original head wouldn't be too happy to see him. The Phoenix had never been particularly fond of him. And this source is credible. That's the problem, I don't know the source. What do you mean you don't know the source? Where did you get the information from? The confusion was evident in the first speaker's tone. I honestly cannot tell you where it's from. Somebody placed it on my desk while I was gone, and there were no traces to indicate the identity of the intruder. I had the intel checked against our own reports, from what we know this is credible information. Both men fell silent, likely thinking of their next course of action. Send some willing scouts and see if we can confirm this source as reliable, there is no doubt it will be beneficial if it is. That was his cue to leave. Naruto disappeared from his hiding spot, satisfied with the developments. As he was sneaking out of the area, his thoughts turned towards his other options. What else could he do to throw a wrench in the plans of the new Beelzebub? Sir, we have just gotten word that our outpost in Gremory territory was attacked. From what we could gather, there were no survivors. The messenger had just finished his report when the presence of his superior spiked with malice and power. Everyone in the vicinity felt the world grow heavy. Many of the weaker soldiers fell to the ground, straining to even keep breathing. Damn those pesky rebels. Beelzebub growled. There was a great crash, wood cracking and breaking, and then only angry breathing. Shalba would need a new desk. At this message to Kateria, I want that Lucifuge girl here. We'll strike those traitorous cowards directly at the heart. They will know the superiority of their betters, he sneered. Naruto could imagine the ugly scowl on his face, marring the normally handsome face. He heard paper shuffling and the scribbling of a pen. It will be done, Lord Beelzebub. The messenger ducked out of the command tent and unfurled his wings, flying off at his top speed towards the main base of the old Satan faction. He noticed neither the eyes tracking him, nor that he was being followed. Half an hour later, the messenger Naruto was following touchdown at his destination. Stopping half a mile away from the territory, Naruto realized that it wouldn't be quite as easy to interfere here. While the camp that Beelzebub and his cohorts were using had been newly constructed and was most likely only a temporary base, this one was of the more permanent sort. The surrounding barriers were more advanced and harder to work around. Even if he could eventually modify or break the magic, it would be too late to make a difference now. Whatever was about to start would not wait for him. When a group of powerful devils left the territory a few hours later, his thoughts were proven right. Shalba wanted his assault to happen now, before any word could reach the other side. One among the group stood out from the rest. Not only was she easily the most powerful of the lot, entrenched in the ranks of the ultimate class, but she was also young in not just appearance, as was normal for most devils no matter their true age. As far as Naruto had been able to ascertain from her power, she had not even finished her first century, making her about the age of the younger powerhouses on the other side. If he hurried now, reaching Gremory territory to tip them off was not out of the question. Or he could just get personally involved this time. For now, following the reinforcements back to Beelzebub's was the best course of action. After an hour of waiting within eyeshot of the camp, the turbulence that he had been able to observe for that time came to an end. In organized fashion, almost all of the devils manning the outpost left for the territory of Pillar Gremory. The new arrivals to the camp were left behind for now, though Naruto was positive that they too would be departing soon, acting as surprise reinforcements for the other troops. None of the devils that had left earlier, except for Beelzebub himself, were exceptionally strong. He would trust that the Gremory were able to hold their own even without being forewarned. However, letting the new group of more powerful devils join the fighting could spell certain doom for the pillar. Even Surziches or Venilana couldn't contend with Beelzebub and these others at the same time. When they took off some time later, Naruto followed. After waiting the ordered 30 minutes, Greya and her entourage took to the skies, flying on a direct course towards the Gremory territory to decisively strike at one of the higher-ranking pillars among the anti-Satan faction. They would be able to cover the ground towards the battleground in about 15 minutes, less if they pushed themselves. Heavy fighting was likely to be waiting for them, so arriving as fresh as possible was paramount to the success of this mission. As they left the forest that marked the early parts of their journey behind them, the air noticeably shifted and a feeling of danger permeated their surroundings. A quick look around told her that she wasn't the only one to have noticed the change. Shifting gazes and tensed shoulders were visible on all of her companions. A moment later, the relative quiet of the situation was broken by the sound of leather meeting flesh, only to be followed by a sickening crack as bone audibly gave way beneath superior force. Without much thought, all of them scattered, putting distance between the sound and themselves. Without even turning around, she knew that her group's number had just been reduced by 1. Her senses weren't able to evaluate the assailant's strength adequately, but he was obviously powerful. The quick turn in the air gave her a view of the plummeting corpse and the attacker falling with it. Moments later, they impacted the rocky ground of the barren wasteland they had been trying to cross. The cloud of dust was kicked up, obscuring their vision of the impact, except for the spiderweb cracks now decorating the ground in all directions. When the dust had settled, she and her companions were given their first good look at their adversary. A hood obscured the man's features from view, and his body was clad in black and brown clothing that was loose enough to allow complete ease of movement, but not so much as to become a hindrance. A quick look at the corpse below him made it clear that the threat their attacker presented was a real one. The head lay at an impossible angle, the neck snapped either from the impact with the ground or the collision with their assailant. At least it had been a quick death. Though he had engaged them, it didn't seem like the man was inclined to be the aggressor any longer, instead choosing to stand on the ground looking nonchalant. The dead devil at his feet destroyed the harmless picture. There was no time to formulate a strategy or even communicate with her companions before the demonic energies, formerly tightly leashed, spiked high, the anger and fury at the death of their comrade palpable in the air. Greya had not known the man personally, but the death still infuriated her. There were not many people that dared attack beings of their strength like this. In the moment before her own potent energies rushed to the surface, Greya got the distinct impression that the man standing beneath them, still looking just as unruffled as before, was smiling in amusement beneath the shadow of his hood. Predictable as always. As Naruto observed the group of devils flying above him, he couldn't help but feel amused, a small grin appearing on his hooded face. Even as the demonic presences of his multiple opponents spiked one after the other, he wasn't worried. While they weren't exactly weak compared to the vast majority of existences in this world, that didn't mean they would have an easy time against him at all. Really, if they so much as nicked him, he would never hear the end of it. If that kind of information got to the company he tended to keep among the supernatural, he'd be mocked for weeks. Azazel would certainly never let it go, which was to say nothing of the more illustrious personalities in his life. A moment later, 2 of the 6 remaining devils dove towards him, while the other 4 prepared or flung different spells. Each and every one intended to end him as efficiently as possible. Reaching inside of himself, not for the power that almost eagerly jumped forward ready to be used, but instead the one comparatively new to him, he began shaping the magical energies in his hand, forming them and imparting on them a nature that the devils approaching him wouldn't be fond of. As the yellow energy took the shape of a spear in his right hand, he took 2 quick steps before launching the magical projectile at the 2 flying towards him and at the same time, their comrades behind them. Both approaching devils predictably evaded the spear with relative ease, though because of that one of the ones casting a spell was forced to abandon their position to dodge. He rushed forward, under the 2 devils that were quickly closing the distance between themselves and him, a small application of chakra, amplifying his speed further. As Naruto swerved around the small-scale attacks impacting the ground around him, he was acutely aware of the 2 others hot on his tail. They had been forced to take a sharp turn in the air from their downward path in the opposite direction, which had slowed them down for a moment, but now they were in rapid pursuit again. Both flew close to the ground, their wings propelling them forward faster than their legs could. Slowly, the 2 gained on him, closing more and more of the remaining distance with every second. The quick repeat of earlier found another light spear in his hand. Naruto vaulted backwards over the heads of his followers and onto the back of one of them. Thrusting down, the spear of light easily penetrated flesh and bone, the light energy firmly implanted in the devil's back as they impacted the rocky ground. Not giving the others any time to capitalize on this, Naruto once more created distance between them with a quick shunshin, placing him next to the corpse of the devil he had attacked in flight. The blood-curdling screams of the injured devil could be heard for leagues in every direction, the light energy taking its poisonous effect on his body. Immediately 2 of the 4 ranged fighters descended towards their injured comrade, among them the most powerful of the lot. The remaining 3 devils, 2 in the air and 1 on the ground, all aimed spells in his direction, though each one was now noticeably more powerful than the last had been, their evaluation of his threat level growing closer and closer to being accurate. Instead of taking action, Naruto was just fine with waiting. In the first place, he was here to waste their time and not necessarily to defeat them. The gray-haired youngster of their group coated her hands in a thick layer of demonic energy before ripping the spear out of the other devil, her companion already busy using healing magic on the wound, accelerating the already high regeneration rate of devils and slowly purging the light energy that had invaded the body even in that short time. Her job done and the spear discarded to the side, she started healing the nasty burn marks on her hands that the energy had inflicted even through her own protective layer of energy. The crippling weakness to light-based powers and abilities that was innate to devil kind really was a bitch to deal with against an opponent who was ready and willing to exploit it. The 2 devils that had remained in the air descended to the ground and started conversing in hushed tones with the one that had been trying to close the gap. Clearly they were trying to devise a strategy against him, and one of them had even been smart enough to cast a quick spell to hide their conversation from his ears. Naruto tried to follow along by reading their lips, but the small amount of lip movements and his admittedly poor ability when it came to doing so with the devil language didn't give him much information to work with, making that attempt largely futile. Instead, he kept an eye on the others. While the healer of the group seemed capable, it wasn't likely that he would be able to heal his injured comrade fast enough to matter in this confrontation. Almost another minute of waiting later and the young devil was able to take care of her hands with her subpar abilities in healing. She joined the other 3 devils and all of them tensed even more as he leaned down. The small piece of paper he placed on the ground went entirely unseen, hidden by dust and rocks, and the ink flashing blue told he that everything was in order. One of the devils reached his breaking point earlier than the others. But the growl that Naruto could pick out even over the distance between them, demonic energy exploded from the tallest of the devils, rising further and further before reaching its utmost limit, well situated in the ranks of the more powerful members of his species. Seeing an orb of potent demonic energy forming in front of the devil was his signal to move. Naruto broke into a run and started circling the group of devils towards the right while dodging the hail of magical projectiles, ranging from orbs of water and fire to simple energy attacks being fired at him. As the intensity and strength of the hail increased, he reached the quarter point of the circle he was tracking around his opponents. A quick application of ice chakra made him slide across the ground the rest of the way, and 5 hand seals later a wall of rock slid from stone, blocking him from his attacker's vision. He left another seal just behind the wall, making 2 of 4. Just as the wall was about to crumble under the continued assault, Naruto cleared it in a single leap, now rushing towards his assailants, kunai and exploding tag already in hand. A simple flick of his wrist and the kunai went flying. His target sidestepped the steel easily enough, letting the weapon harmlessly sail past them. Just as the weapon passed one devil, Naruto's left hand formed a seal, activating the explosive tag attached to the projectile. The resulting explosion once again led to confusion among the group of devils, a cloud of smoke obscuring their vision, even if the physical damage done to them was limited. 3 devils immediately took to the sky to avoid being attacked under the cover of the smokescreen, leaving a single one of them alone. Naruto entered the cloud of smoke an instant later, joining the last devil that remained inside. A pained grunt followed by the sound of a body hitting the ground were the only noises greeting them from inside the smoke. As the seconds began to tick by, they started a hail of magical attacks on the gradually fading smokescreen, ignoring the possibility of hitting their comrade. If they didn't do anything, he was dead anyway. For a minute the magical bombardment continued until eventually ceasing, all of them convinced that there was nothing but rubble and ruin left under the dust and smoke. An unnatural gust of wind dispersed the cloud a moment later. Right in the middle stood their still silent assailant, completely unfazed by the barrage they had unleashed, and at his feet, face down in the dirt, was their comrade. 5 small points on his head were still smoking slightly, and other burns and wounds littered his body. Obviously he had been used as a shield. The mocking quirk of the lips on the face of the man that had been holding them up for almost 15 minutes now only served to fuel their anger even further. In the end they all knew they were outmatched, which made the situation even harder to accept. The only real choice they had was to abandon their mission and retreat. They had to admit defeat. Now, to abandon their comrade or leave him to his fate. Just like all of them, he was an important member of their side, easily above the power of a normal high-class devil, and even those were in short supply. Before they could make any decision, their opponent waved his hand, a swell of unfamiliar power accompanying the movement. Their surroundings reacted instantly. Great vortexes surrounded them, the rapid displacement of air creating a sudden booming sound akin to an explosion. Wind was flinging them through the air, away from their opponent and towards their two occupied comrades. After a moment they passed a barrier which stopped the wind but let them through. After righting themselves in the air, all three of them landed around their healer. The ground was clearly safer than the air. What do we do? The question was on all of their minds. None of them had ever been in a situation like this. Even their stronger attacks were useless, and their opponent didn't seem to be breaking a sweat. Their attacker picked up the body at his feet and flung it in the direction that he had originally come from, the body landing some meters away from the ruins of the stone wall he had created before. When their eyes switched to him again, he was halfway submerged in the ground. Soon he had disappeared completely between the rock and earth, leaving not a trace of his presence above ground. Tracking him was difficult but not impossible. She tried to catch onto his magical signature, where it was moving, how strong it was, but it was elusive, seeming to fight her attempts at grasping it. Focusing further, she noticed a second near-identical signature had appeared and was moving at a right angle to the first. Obviously he was trying to trap them by attacking from two sides at the same time. No, that's too obvious. Before Greya could give words to her thoughts, her comrades had already moved. All four of them dashed in the direction of their fallen comrade, arriving at the same time as their opponent, and an identical twin appeared at their own destinations. One of them opposite the ruin of the wall, the other opposite the body of the first causality. Acting on her hunch, she elected to fly high and away, in the direction of their opponent. Maybe the air was not safe, but her gut was telling her that the ground wasn't either. A quick glance revealed that he was forming seals again. From her position in the air, she had a much better view of the whole field, and she saw exactly what their opponent was doing. Behind the crumbled wall, at his and his doppelganger's current positions, and a bit behind their first comrade, 4 slips of paper were placed on the ground, evenly spaced apart and forming a simple circle. Trapping all of her comrades in its bounds. It's a trap. Her comrades all turned to her, and then their opponent, who was now holding the last seal, his index and middle finger extended upwards, the others curved inwards. They tried to react, to somehow move away, but it was already too late. Phew. Everything froze with a swell of the same power from before. Shining above her comrades was a blue dome of energy. For a moment she thought that the energy looked clustered together without rhyme or reason, but there were really signs and symbols, repeating over and over again. It seemed similar to a magic crest, but used vastly different symbols. Peering inside the dome revealed no movement at all. Not from her comrades, who had been frozen mid-motion, or even the dust that had been kicked up when they had rushed to evade the trap she had called out. Clearly she should not expect any assistance from that direction. So, now that we finally have some peace and quiet, let's talk. I don't talk to my enemies, Greya replied with steel in her voice. He seemed completely unconcerned with her tone, which only served to agitate her more. Even if she wasn't the most powerful devil, she could certainly claim to be among the strongest their side had to offer. She glanced around the area for a moment, but the second one of him was nowhere to be seen. Only a small puff of smoke remained where she had last seen the second figure standing. I'm not really your enemy, and what else is there to do but talk? Your friends won't be moving for a while, and you can't help them as long as I'm here, he said, and seemed to be telling the truth too. You just killed 2 of my comrades, injured another, and then locked the rest inside some kind of barrier, yet you are not my enemy? I find that hard to believe. Doesn't really matter to me what you believe. But after unceremoniously seating himself on the ground cross-legged, he continued, we have time, so ask away. It pissed her off that her opponent didn't even think of her as a potential threat. It scratched at her pride as a lucifuge and a devil. She wanted to lash out, but she could control herself if necessary. Who are you? Her first question was as direct as it was predictable. You wouldn't know me. But that's not really what you want to know anyway, Naruto answered flippantly. Seeing the muscles in her face tighten in response, threatened to make a grin appear on his face. Now that the seriousness of the situation had lessened, there was no reason not to have a little fun. What are you then? A crow? I see why you'd think that, but no, I'm no fallen angel neither before you ask. I'm human, mostly. What business would a human have with devils? Incredulous didn't even begin to describe her tone of voice. Clearly she didn't buy that for a moment. Naruto did not blame her. As a general rule, humanity was maddeningly weak, with a rare few exceptions. That's for me to stay silent on and for you to find out, lucifuge. The rise of her shoulders told him that his information had been spot on, even if she schooled her expression impressively quickly. After a moment of deliberation, Naruto continued, I would suggest speaking with your superiors. Some of them may still know me, or have at the very least heard of me. The devils I've had dealings with aren't really very numerous anymore. Will you continue interfering with our interests? Now, I wouldn't be here if that wasn't the plan, no. Really, I couldn't care less about your civil war, but I have a reputation to uphold. Contract breakers aren't exactly well liked, you understand, I'm sure. Studying his opposite for a moment longer, Naruto tipped his head to the side in thought. Why exactly do you fight anyway? I mean, I get the whole family tradition thing, but is there anything else to it? Rizivim isn't even participating as far as I know. Spotting the immediate tensing of her shoulders combined with her sudden scowl clued him in on how she would react even before she opened her mouth. Have care how you address Lord Lucifer. As a daughter of House Lucifuge, I will defend his name against any slights. The narrowing of her eyes and the affront that had entered her tone told him all he needed to know. Oh? What are you gonna do, intimidate me? Attack me? I would advise against uttering threats you have no ability to follow through with. Among devils she was certainly able to make threats to almost all of them as well, but outside of the biblical factions the story changed quite a bit. Smartly she stayed quiet after that. So what's your reason really? I know for sure that Rizivim isn't taking any part in the civil war, and for me that would mean your family could do what they want. I mean, if you guys lose, there is probably gonna be a new Lucifer eventually anyway, even if the one that takes that name didn't inherit it naturally. Even if Lord Lucifer does not personally take part in this war, he has still allied himself with the forces fighting for the rightful Satans. In his name, do my family and others combat the pretenders. Well, that was nice and all, but if I cared to hear that kind of thing I would have tracked down your father. And even he doesn't really mean it. Compared to him you are terrible at concealing it too, Naruto said, unconvinced. She honestly looked surprised at being called out too. If you cared to ask me, my money is on pride and a sense of duty, but I don't really know you personally. Believe in the old order of things. Don't care either way. Just interested in fighting. That one certainly wouldn't be the first time for your kind. Or maybe you aren't ready for such a big choice yet. Even if the question could be interpreted as mocking, his interest was sincere, though he didn't really expect her to answer, or at least not truthfully. Shrugging his shoulders as she kept her silence, Naruto changed the topic. No matter. Since you won't sate my curiosity, I will take my leave. Despite the nature of our meeting, I do wish you a pleasant day, Miss Lucifuge, Naruto said and stood from his position on the ground. His respectful nod toward her was received with surprise and after a little hesitation answered in kind. She zoned in on the rise of his hand the moment he started moving it. Whether she truly expected an attack or was just being cautious he wasn't sure, but the rise in her demonic energy was obvious enough. Her eyes were closely following his movements, noting the position of his fingers, though there was no recognition in her eyes. His fingers now in the proper position, a quick application of chakra had him moving away from the battlefield, leaving her with a parting comment and a grin. I estimate an hour. Overlooking the battlefield from a cliff made judging the relative strength of both sides much easier. Though easier in this case didn't translate to easy. Combat involving magic tended to be more strongly affected by exceptional individuals, which was the reason for his interference in the first place. Even in his own world a single shinobi had had the ability to turn the tide of a battle involving thousands. He should know that had been his role at certain points as well, and even those past feats sometimes paled in comparison to what some devils were capable of in sheer scale. Personally, he would call it lacking in terms of finesse, but if it worked, why worry? Identifying those special individuals became a lot harder at a distance though. Of course, he had delayed the most powerful reinforcements for one side, but that wouldn't necessarily guarantee victory on its own. If the other side didn't have comparable individuals themselves, even the delay he had created would change nothing. For now, leaving them without further interference and simply observing the proceedings would be best, though there was only so much time he could give them. Even if he had estimated an hour, he wouldn't stake the success of this battle on that alone. The chance that the Lucifuge girl could find some way to interfere with his seal wasn't big, but it was there. If she couldn't do it alone, the weaker reinforcements that had been sent after her group would have the necessary strength and numbers to break it eventually. Thinking back on that confrontation nearly made him shake his head. Devils at large, while formidable in terms of raw power, weren't really all that great at actual combat. Most of them tended to rely heavily on their natural magical abilities. Against other devils or even many of the other supernatural creatures of this world that was enough, but there were those who you couldn't simply overwhelm with raw power. Those were the real threats, and he was one of them. What good was control over fire magic, which in effect was not too dissimilar from what could be accomplished with the right jutsu, except maybe for scale, if you only used that ability to throw fire directly at your foe. Some devils eventually thought of torching the ground or cutting off escape routes, but beside that there wasn't much in terms of variety. Maybe in a strange way most people in the supernatural world had too much power when it came to that. He had certainly suffered from the same approach sometimes. As a Jinchuriki, especially of the Kyuubi, there wasn't really a fear of ever running out of chakra. So why not fling as much chakra at your enemy as possible? That train of thought had been beaten out of him in training, even if it had taken a few tries. In comparison, the amount of destruction a normal genin or even chunin was capable of employing was usually limited, even when you factored in explosive seals. Jonin and especially certain parts of Anbu, that was where you got large-scale mayhem, but even that wasn't the same as what powerful supernatural creatures were capable of and used almost casually. When an Anbu demolition team caused that kind of damage, it had a specific purpose. Anbu were the best, specialists in every way, but above all else precise. If you wanted to bring down a mountainside, you could simply fling as much force at it as you had access to until you eventually reached your goal. Or you could get an earth user, analyze for the best weak points, and bring the whole thing down on your enemy's heads with barely any chakra use at all. Really, what a mess this is gonna be. Should be a fun few years. Even though the sun had sunken beyond the horizon hours ago, the inside of the grand hotel room was illuminated brightly, the no doubt expensive interior of the penthouse suite, serving only as a backdrop to the negotiation that was about to take place between the people now entering the room. It was just his luck that the complete glass front, more and more common in the circles his usual targets frequented, gave him a perfect view from his spot on top of a skyscraper near 2 kilometers away. The first people to enter immediately started checking every corner of the suite for any potential listening devices or other dangers. After a small signal, other people started entering, 2 of them men who were noticeably dressed in more expensive outfits. Both of them had 2 visibly armed bodyguards directly following them to their destination, a sitting area dotted with couches and chairs. While both men took seats opposite of each other, only a small glass table separating them, the 2 men that had entered the room first were now closing the curtains, robbing him of a clear sight. While an effective deterrent against most humans, it didn't affect him the same way, the crosshair of his sniper rifle already trained on the correct spot. Factoring in both wind and distance was not necessary for someone of his abilities. A deep breath out, in, half a breath out, and now hold. Focusing his chakra into the bullet already prepared for this occasion, activated the added enchantments. Wind chakra would envelop the projectile as soon as it left the muzzle, the gun specifically modified to allow for such a feat. One smooth motion of his index finger pulled the trigger and engaged the mechanism. A moment later, the loud sound of the machine, even if muffled slightly by the attached silencer, echoed across the empty and quiet night sky of the city. Not even a second later, the glass of the suite exploded in a shower of sparks, the fabric of the long curtains posing no resistance to the magically enhanced high-caliber projectile. The small seal placed on the underside of the couch opposite of the one his target sat on transmitted the noise inside the room to his ear before fading away moments later. Clean hit. Slowly sitting up from his admittedly uncomfortable position lying on the concrete rooftop for the last 2 hours, Naruto didn't allow himself to waste any time. Remaining in position would be foolish, and he would need to ensure that he left no trace behind. He had only just moved the gun into the case next to him when the ground behind him was illuminated with the formation of a familiar magic circle. As the circle slowly took shape, he gathered everything else still present. The casing of the fired bullet disappeared in his pocket, while a small bottle of water and the binoculars he had used early in the night were also stowed away in the weapon case. A quick look made it clear that nothing else was left, and any remaining marks in the rooftop were removed with a quick application of earth chakra, smoothing the concrete as if it was new. The now fully formed magic circle behind him flashed brightly a moment later before revealing the person he had expected as soon as the magic circle had started appearing. "What do you need, Greya? You know that I'm working." "I need your help," Greya said. "We have a bit of a situation on our hands that requires your expertise." Naruto muttered under his breath. "So do you need me, or does your husband think that I would not accept if he had asked, so he sent you in his stead?" Crossing his arms in front of his chest, he studied her further. "And if I accept, do you need me now, or can I finish work first?" "Preferably now, but the problem is relatively stable for the moment." Nodding once in acceptance, Naruto kept looking at Greya in silence, a slight frown on his face. "I suggested your help," Greya admitted after a moment of silence. "It is technically speaking not my problem, but I would help if I could, so I'm asking you to do so instead." He could see the sincerity in her eyes. Reading her expressions had become harder over the years, but he had trained her, few people had that advantage. However, that meant he could also detect that there were things she wasn't telling him that he probably wouldn't be very happy about. "Fine, since you ask I'll bite, but I don't guarantee anything until I know what I'm dealing with," Naruto relented. Picking up the weapon case with his right hand, he gestured toward the magic circle with his left. "Come on, knowing you and especially Surzich's, I'll be busy for the next few hours at the very least." "Thank you, Naruto." Even though he could hear her honest sincerity, he couldn't stop himself from rolling his eyes. "Save it for when I actually did anything beyond accepting to take a look." A step and a turn and they were standing next to each other in the circle that had started glowing again. "So what does Surzich's need me for?" Greya started channeling her demonic energy into the circle at their feet before answering. Well, it's not directly his problem either. An asking look in her direction was the last thing that passed between them before they were sucked into the circle and transported to the underworld. A quick look at his surroundings catalogued all entrances more out of habit than any real caution. If Greya did truly wish him ill, she would face him in battle. The relatively small room, at least compared to the usual for devils, was almost barren except for a single wooden door directly opposite them. Following Greya as she headed out of the room, Naruto placed his free hand in his pocket. As she opened the door and bid him to step through, he got a good look at this problem. I shouldn't even be surprised anymore, and yet I still am. Sprawled on the ground in the middle of a magic circle decorating almost the entire floor of the room he had entered was a girl. The clothing spoke of a student, the condition of some magical struggles, maybe 13 or 14 years old. A quick feel of his surroundings revealed the purpose of the circle the girl was placed in. All magical energies within were being held in place by force. Even if it wasn't the best work he had seen from Greya, it had most likely been created under duress. The still unstable energies in the girl spoke volumes. Even dulled by the seal, his magical senses could detect both holy and demonic energy in her. Strategizing sat on the opposite side of the room, in a separate part of the greater circle, meant to fuel the magic being enacted directly around the unconscious black-haired girl. "You want to explain now?" Naruto said. A turn of his head revealed Greya now sitting in a similar position as her husband on the side of the room they had just entered from. Strategizing now looked visibly less strained, even though his senses told him that the Lucifer was nowhere near empty. Continuously powering magic or seals of this scale and power was never comfortable, especially when the seal hadn't been fine-tuned. The girl is a fallen human hybrid. Rias wanted to reincarnate her as a devil and her queen after recently being presented with her own set of evil pieces, Greya answered. And you just thought that whatever Ijuka invents is gonna always work out fine. Mixing holy and demonic energies in the same vessel is hard enough even under controlled conditions. She is a growing hybrid as is, her power is already not completely stable at that age, Naruto retorted harshly. The mix of both energies was rare, though it was possible since they essentially weren't really separate. They were different, like colors of light, but at their core they were still the same thing. Otherwise that type of hybrid would have never been possible in the past. The Nephilim were no more, but they had been such a fusion, though they had been born that way. I was not involved in the decision. And if that wasn't Greya's way of saying, we will talk about this more later. He didn't know what was. For a moment he almost pitied the current Lucifer. Greya could be downright vicious if she wanted to be, but as it was most likely Strategizing's fault that it had come to this in the first place, there would be no sympathy from Naruto either. Strategizing's idiocy then, I suppose. Whatever, the situation is as it is. Is Rias here? I may need her to stabilize the girl. Walking to the edge of the affected area, Naruto crouched down and took another look at the exact mechanics of the circle. After 2 minutes of studying all the relevant parts and double-checking just to make sure, Naruto got to work. Focusing chakra into the tip of his index finger, he began drawing additional seals on top of the ones already in place. First he needed to isolate the center portion of the seal, hindering most of the energy from either leaving or entering. While the other parts had been necessary for maintaining the effect for a prolonged period of time, especially when setting the circle up on the fly, he didn't need it to be able to do that anymore. The stopgap he intended to set up now would need maybe half an hour. Whatever he could do afterwards wasn't assured yet and would definitely take longer. After doing a full circle and drawing his own seals around the outer edge of the established ones, and then checking again if everything was correct, Naruto sat down in front of the girl. A smaller, much simpler circle of seals around himself connected him to the one he had drawn. Hands now in front of his chest, Naruto formed the ram seal, helping him in drawing out his chakra, slowly, carefully. Seals needed precision more than power. Taking over established seals could be done in 2 ways, completely overwhelming the established seal with your own power, or integrating the present mechanics into your own seal work. The second method was usually a lot harder, but Greya hadn't needed to protect her own work from outside interference in this instance, so the process was made much simpler for him. The differences between his own seal work and the magic circles used by most magic users didn't matter in this instance either. Usually combining both types of script restricted you more than it helped, but his own seal wasn't very complicated. It also helped that Greya wasn't using her magical energies to maintain control, simply yielding it to him as soon as his chakra prodded at the mechanism. A moment later the outer portions of the circle dimmed, no longer active, and then quickly vanished. The quiet sound of relief from behind him and the theatrical performance going on in front of his eyes made it apparent that the other 2 adults in the room were no longer feeling the strain of actively maintaining the magic circle. Naruto increased his own output of chakra, the full strain of maintaining the current state landing on his own reserves. His hands released the seal they had been holding. The seal was his now, following his commands and needs so long as he had the necessary chakra to maintain it. With his reserves, Naruto could keep that up for more than a day if needs be. Stepping into the inner circle, where the girl that had been completely inert just moments before was now breathing heavily, Naruto sat down next to her before raising one hand above her head. Did you give her anything? And did she suddenly lose control of her energies, or was it a gradual process? One hand on her forehead and the other moving over multiple spots all over her body, he checked the flow of her internal energies. Nothing and sudden, Greya answered without fanfare. She clearly was aware that this situation still called for prudence, though she had never really struggled with that to begin with. Nodding once to indicate that he had heard her answer, he moved his left hand over the girl's stomach. Magical energies originated in the soul, tethered to the body through the brain and the magical core in the stomach. Right now the evil piece inside the girl, fueled by the demonic energy of her king, was trying to change her body, as it was designed to do, while her own innate light energy was trying to ward off the transformation. Even fallen angels possessed light energy in their bodies, though the details differed slightly from the light energy present in a true angel. For now the only thing he could do without any preparation was stopping the process cold. There were technically other options, but the girl wouldn't survive those as she currently was. Luckily Rias was still young and therefore weak. Unfortunately she had inherited the same power of destruction that had made her brother feared on the battlefield, so simply using his own chakra as a small barrier around the evil piece wouldn't hold for long, though maybe long enough to start on a long-term solution. Tell your sister to suppress her own energy as much as she can. What I'm about to do won't hold for long, but it will stabilize her and give us the opportunity and time to work on a real solution. Prepare for a long night. Seeing Surziches leave the room in the direction that he could sense Rias in, Naruto got to work. From one moment to the next Naruto was aware of his surroundings. The sunlight drifting onto his face through the window of his bedroom, the covers on his body, the warm body cuddled into him, breathing still slow and deep. Obviously she was still asleep. Opening his eyes he checked the sun, visible from his window. He usually woke up early, still a reminder of his childhood and the training that even now affected his life so many centuries later, and he always woke up earlier than the person currently sharing his bed, though that also had other reasons. Trying to get up without waking her up was once again a trial in and of itself, but in the end his arm was free and he was ready to start the day. Stretching his arms, Naruto moved towards the shower in the adjacent room while grabbing a change of clothes on the way there. A quick shower later, the white-haired shinobi stepped back into his bedroom, an unbuttoned shirt and a black pair of pants already thrown on. In contrast to when he had left earlier, the single remaining occupant of the room was no longer asleep, but instead stretching her arms far above her head, the movement drawing attention to her generous figure. I didn't mean to wake you up. Continuing further into the room as he buttoned his shirt, Naruto watched her finish her full body stretch before collapsing back onto the mattress from his peripheral vision. Don't worry, she answered, her voice still a bit rough from just waking up. For a moment it seemed as if Kuroka was about to continue talking, but instead a big yawn split the air and she abandoned that idea to make herself comfortable again, eyes closed and head once more deposited on the pillow. You want breakfast now, or should I come wake you up again in an hour? Having buttoned up his shirt and put on a tie and a wristwatch, Naruto made to leave the room, asking his question without looking back. We have time for that. The hopeful tone in her voice would have made him roll his eyes if he wasn't already accustomed to her love for sleeping or laying around. She was still better than an actual cat in that regard anyway. I'd like to get to Kuoh before 8 if we can. It is a school day for the children there. We are gonna need about an hour by car, so we still have some time. I need to do some paperwork anyway. Looking over his shoulder, Naruto could spot the exact moment that Kuroka made her decision. Her posture, which until now had indicated that she was about to really get up even if reluctantly, immediately relaxed and she seemed to bury further into the soft bed. He couldn't quite suppress a small, amused smile. In an hour then. Opening the door he made to step out when another thought occurred to him. Handle in hand and door held ajar, Naruto addressed Kuroka again. When you get dressed, maybe pick something less exposing than usual, it is a school we are visiting. Seeing her turn towards him only to childishly stick her tongue out only made him chuckle. Naruto stepped out, closing the door behind him. Running a hand through his hair, he moved towards his office. Paperwork awaited him. In the end, the whole trip hadn't taken quite as long as he had predicted. Traffic had been manageable, and he may or may not have driven a bit faster than strictly allowed, not that anybody would be able to remember it. Pulling into the correct street, Naruto stopped the car right in front of the entrance of the school grounds. Turning the key to quiet the engine, he turned to the side to face his companion after a moment of silence. You ready? Even though he had made it a question, it was very clear to him that Kuroka was nervous. Her fingers were fiddling with the hem of her clothes, though Naruto knew it wasn't her physical appearance she was nervous about. Slowly she turned her head to look at him. She deserves this, to know the truth and to hear it from me, Kuroka said, though she seemed no more sure than before. At that he could only nod. Yes, she does, but that doesn't mean it has to be here now. For a moment it seemed as if Kuroka would respond, but in the end she stayed silent, facing the front again. Still debating in her head if she should go through with this. The complicated expression on her face was a rarity, but entirely understandable considering the situation. Whatever she chose to do today, he would support her in any way he could. Kuroka did truly love her sister, almost like a mother did her children. Leaving her behind, uncertain of her future, had been hard, and for months after that Kuroka had been consumed with guilt, taking the blame for everything that had happened. Becoming a stray and fleeing before anybody could associate Shirin directly with her actions. It had all been a hasty decision, but one driven by the need to protect her sister at all cost. However hasty the decision may have been, in the end, Kuroka had succeeded in her goals. Shirin had been saved from those that had threatened her, had been taken in by the Gremory, certainly a good place all things considered, and Kuroka had found a way to evade capture and too much confrontation. It had been a week later that she had contacted him, not that she had known who he was back then. He had offered his assistance to the Yokai centuries in the past to repay the assistance he had received himself. In return for services rendered he would be available for help in any way possible, should any of them require it. Like a family tradition, the way to contact him had been passed down from parents to children if ever they truly saw no way to deal with the trouble that awaited them. Even though he had made that promise long ago, he had always intended to keep it for as long as he was capable of doing so. Until now he had never failed to do so. Admittedly, his services had not been required often, twice a century at most. While he had slipped into reminiscing, Kuroka had continued her silent contemplation. Reaching over, he gently pried her fingers away from their fiddling before taking her hand into his larger one. As she once again looked at him, he started slowly running his thumb along the back of her hand. "Kuroka," Naruto said, trying to show support but not letting her drop her gaze either. "I did not mean to question your actions. Whatever you choose to do, I'm right here." A moment of silence passed between them before Naruto could see her relax a bit, the small frown that had worked its way onto her face fading away. "Yes, I know," Kuroka answered, a small lopsided smile appearing on her face. Seeing that Naruto couldn't stop a corner of his mouth from tilting upwards as well. Giving her hand a squeeze, Naruto let go and stepped out of the car. A quick look around showed that some of the students walking around were already giving the vehicle interested looks, which seemed to only increase in intensity after he had stepped out. Walking around the front before stopping on the other side, Naruto opened the passenger door. As soon as the door was opened, Kuroka stepped out as well, immediately hooking an arm around one of his own after he had closed the door behind her. The two of them were garnering a lot of looks now, though that was only to be expected. Most students in this complex were entirely normal, and even disregarding their appearance, both Naruto and Kuroka had a presence about them by virtue of their supernatural powers that was hard to ignore, even if the students didn't actually know what it was that was drawing their attention. First stop. Student council. Issei had been in a pretty good mood recently. That is, until the situation last night. For a bit it had really seemed as if he would be able to lose his virginity to Butchu. However, then that incredibly hot mate had interrupted them. For a bit he had been too overwhelmed by the great op-eye on display right in front of him, but eventually he had remembered what had been said. Even if Rias had said to forget about it, the whole exchange had been stuck in his head for the whole night, repeating in his dream until he wasn't quite sure which version had really happened. The desperation on her face when she had surprised him in his room was still overwhelming for him. Then there was that voice he had heard a night prior to that. His partner, the one from his sacred gear. So much had happened in just a few days. He had asked Asia if she had noticed anything off in the time, but the newest member of the club hadn't had much input. She had only recently gotten to know all the other members after all. Asking Kiba hadn't helped either. Well, the pretty boy hadn't known precisely what was going on. He had said that Akeno or Rias would likely tell them if it was truly urgent. Just as the school grounds came into sight, Kiba had stopped. A moment later Issei started focused on his surroundings. In front of the entrance to the school, right there on the street, was a car he had never seen before. Not only was parking not even allowed right there, but the car seemed to exude a weird presence all its own. A quick look behind him showed that Kiba was also looking at the vehicle with narrowed eyes, likely picking up much more from the whole situation than he was able to. As he was still looking at the blonde knight, he could see his eyes wander in the direction of the clubroom, where they widened slightly with trepidation. Putting his meager sensing abilities to the test, Issei tried his best to pick up on what Kiba had noticed, but he couldn't feel anything. His range was still not big enough. Kiba's muttered, "What is going on?" Followed shortly by surprised exclamation from Asia made Issei turn his focus to the new school building. He couldn't sense anything. Resolving to get to the clubroom as quickly as possible, he sped up, Kiba and Asia right behind him. It didn't take long to make it to the old school building. A quick knock on the correct door later, and the three of them were entering their clubroom, where they were greeted by Rias, Akeno, Keko, and surprisingly the maid from last night. "Rafia-san." As Asia threw him a questioning look and Kiba looked at him in confusion, the attention of those already in the room turned to three of them. The maid offered a nod in greeting, while Rias addressed the three of them after standing up from her seated position behind her desk. "Looks like you are all here now. Milady, should I expla?" Greya's question was interrupted by a raised arm from Rias, signaling for her silence. The three of them had stepped into the room proper, closing the door behind them. Keko, who had been sitting on one of the couches, threw a nod in Kiba's direction while still maintaining her stoic and quiet persona. Either she knew what was going on already, as Issei suspected Kiba did, or she was simply unfazed by the occasion as was the norm. The truth is, before Rias was able to finish her statement, the room was lit up by the orange glow of an appearing magic crest, followed moments later by a brilliant display of orange flames, engulfing half of that side of the room. Asia had grabbed onto Issei's arm for support, while most of the people in the room looked on in surprise. The flames disappeared and a blonde man remained in their place. "Phoenix?" Kiba shouted in surprise, breaking the ensuing silence and throwing up even more questions for Issei. Dressed in a red blazer with a white shirt underneath, the top button undone in a casually confident way that Issei couldn't hope to imitate, the blonde man cut quite the striking figure. Issei already disliked him. Turning towards them all, the man addressed the room. "I haven't been to the human world in a while," the man said, and threw a dismissive glance around the room before zeroing in on Rias and continuing, "But I have come for you now, my love." Before Issei could voice the question on the tip of his tongue, the tension that had appeared in the room was dispelled by a sharp knock on the door. Looking around, Issei could see confused expressions on all of the people in the room, excluding Greya, who, while looking in the direction of the newest addition to the room, seemed to ignore him entirely, almost as if she was trying to look through him. After several seconds had passed in silence, Rias seemed to remember her role and answered the knock, a slight questioning lull to her voice. "Enter." The attention of everyone in the room was on the door as it was slowly opened, revealing two people standing in the doorway. Issei's focus was immediately on the woman. Long black hair, hergless figure, and amazing, even if they were hidden from view by an outfit similar in style to the man next to her. A quick swipe of his hand got rid of the small amount of blood dripping from his nose. Issei was able to slowly drag his gaze away from the woman and to the side, to the person that had just opened the door. Looking at the man, who currently had his eyes focused somewhere else, made Issei draw some parallels between him and the blonde guy that had appeared before. Both had blue eyes, exuded confidence, were taller than him, and were even dressed somewhat similarly. Beyond those similarities, however, the differences were more important. A shock of white hair crowned the new man's head in place of the blonde hair on the other. Both of them were taller than everyone else in the room, but the white-haired man still had the blonde one beat, even if only slightly. Their clothing, while somewhat similar, also differed in the details. The blonde man's attire looked very casual with the blazer and top button undone, the other was more professional, maybe. What the hell did he know about fashion? White shirt, tie and a waistcoat as if he was some gentleman from England or somewhere. Thrown over his arm was what looked like a coat. In that moment the man's eyes turned on him and his body reacted. Primal instincts older than any ability to reason were activated without any conscious thought on Issei's part. Instantly it felt as if every muscle in his body had seized up, allowing neither breath nor movement. He had never wondered what paralysis would feel like, but right now he was sure it must be like this. Issei could feel his own heartbeat loudly echoing in his head. It was the only sound he could still hear, and even that was slowly losing its momentum. Trying against all hope to hold on just a little longer. Every thought in his mind, every instinct in his body was telling him to flee, to make a run for it, to put as much distance as he could between him and whatever this man was. And slowly another feeling developed, as if peeking out of the darkness his thoughts were now consumed by. Another way out of this, to simply end it right here, right now, no matter what every sliver of thought he could still work up was telling him. Simply submit to this feeling, this presence. To curl up on the floor and let everything fade. In that moment Issei thought he knew exactly how prey must feel in the presence of its predator. Every cell of his body was screaming at him in horror, but his body refused any command, nothing would answer the slowly quieting scream for escape in his own mind. Agonizingly slowly a single second ticked by, though to him it felt like he had been standing there for at least a week when his thoughts were suddenly invaded. "Partner, snap out of it." It didn't matter to him where the voice had come from or really anything regarding it. It was as if a spell had been broken and all his focus was on the sweet feeling of air in his lungs and his pulse thundering back into existence as he almost collapsed on the floor, barely managing to catch himself on his knees. Harsh panting breaths escaped his mouth, greedily sucking in lungful after lungful, and he realized that his face was slick with sweat. Judging by the loud exclamations he had the attention of the entire room. "Issei. Issei-san." However right now Issei couldn't really hear any of them, didn't really understand the words. Nothing could reach him right now. His senses still nothing but background noise to his heartbeat and breathing. What was that? What doesn't matter right now, you'd better get a grip quickly boy. That voice again, the same one from one night ago, that had introduced itself as his partner. His sacred gear. As his breathing slowly regulated itself and it became easier to focus on his surroundings, Issei spared his left hand a glance, though nothing happened in response. Slowly he forced himself upright with Asia's assistance, who was continuing to worriedly fuss even after she had helped him sit down on one of the couches. Well, that certainly was underwhelming. Looking up at the man that had addressed the room, Issei was careful to avoid matching his gaze, reluctant to experience a repeat of whatever had just happened. The two newcomers took steps into the room, the man dipping his head in greeting in the direction of Greya before addressing Keno. His female companion was still focused entirely on the small form of Keko seated on one of the couches. Neither of them seemed to be paying any of the other people in the room any mind. Keno, I trust that there have been no complications since I last saw you. No, Naruto-sensei. Immediately some heads turned towards the black-haired queen. Notably neither Rias nor Greya visibly reacted to her words, obviously already aware of whatever the man was talking about. Good. Stopping next to the blonde man he continued. It seems like we came at an inopportune time, but my business really is quite important, so I hope it won't be a bother if we stay here while you discuss whatever important things you are meeting for, Riser-kun, Rias. Getting his breathing under control again, though he could still feel his heart beating faster than normal, meant that Issei was able to more closely study everyone. Rias and the now revealed Riser seemed honestly confused, if not baffled by the interruption, and his king was still sending him worried glances. Kiba seemed equally confused though he was also clearly tense, analyzing his surroundings as if the situation could devolve into combat in a moment. Keno looked somehow both annoyed and positively surprised. Asia was still worrying, clearly ignoring most of the things going on around them, her focus entirely on him. The one that was most off-putting was surprisingly Keko. Issei wasn't sure if he had ever seen the white-haired girl show this much emotion. Though to be fair he hadn't really interacted with her that much yet. Her eyes were wide, focused on the woman accompanying this Naruto guy, while her mouth had dropped open in a display of shock that was unlike the tiny rook. Clearly those two knew each other already. I guess so. Though it is a rather private matter. Ria's answer was what once again turned his focus to the three new people in the room. His king sounded hesitant, which was quite unlike her, the complicated expression on her face a stark change from her resolute if not cold demeanor from before. That is true, but we are already aware of the situation. Your marriage is known to many even outside of the underworld. That is what you are meeting for, no? Well, that sounded kind of reasonable, Rick. Marriage? For one moment Issei's mind blanked completely again. He must have misheard right. Surely not. Just as he opened his mouth to question the newcomer, someone else did that very thing. You dare interrupt me to involve yourself in the matters of nobility. This is not only a matter of the pillars, but one between only me and my fiancé. The blonde man had seemingly run out of patience and snapped. The person he had addressed on the other hand only raised an eyebrow, not bothered in the slightest. Yes, I dare. Unfortunately you have become involved through sheer happenstance, and I do apologize for the inconvenience, but my own affairs concern Rias, even if only by association. And aren't you judging too quickly? I do not believe we have personally had the pleasure. Instead of further addressing the outraged blonde, Naruto turned back toward Rias. However, since the lady has already given her permission, we shall remain. Do not worry, our presence won't disrupt proceedings much. You'll barely know we are here. Seemingly finished saying his piece, the two simply walked to one side of the room. A moment later a couch identical to the others in the room appeared behind them, and they sat down. For a moment the room was held in awkward silence. Slowly the blonde man lost the irritated twist to his lips and focused back on Rias, completely disregarding the interruption as if it had never happened. The two apparently engaged devils started talking again, shortly interrupted by Akeno's offer of tea. As she left to prepare the beverages, Riser seated himself on one of the empty couches before inviting Rias to join him. Even Issei was able to notice the tense air between the two, frayed as his concentration still was. Underwhelming honestly doesn't even cover it. Naruto hadn't expected much, the wielder of the boosted gear was young yet and only recently reincarnated and informed of the supernatural to boot, but even so, well, no use complaining about it. In time the boy would obtain power in any case, not that it would matter should it come down to it. He had learned enough about those that housed one of the heavenly dragons. Dragralbian themselves, that would be cause for some concern, but their wielders. Even in the future they wouldn't present a personal threat. Naruto put it out of his mind and observed the room at large and all of its occupants. Even if most of them weren't a threat, the other occupants of the room were certainly interesting. The former nun-turned-devil, the church's failed experiment, a currently stable fallen devil hybrid, one of the few remaining Nakausho, Drake's current host, the Gremory Bale girl, that power of destruction really was one nasty piece of work, a phoenix, and the queen of Lucifer himself. Though that part was not what made Greya truly interesting. However, interesting only got you so far, and the discussion currently going on between the two engaged devils exemplified at least one area in which they were still lacking. It seemed like both of them had chosen to continue from where they had been interrupted by his arrival. I told you already, Riser, I don't intend to marry you. Rias, I don't believe you are in any position to be this selfish. Our fathers arranged this matter years ago. Whether we will marry or not is not up for discussion. This is a part of our duties as pure-blooded devils. Riser's tone was rather calm if not outright flippant. Clearly her denial was neither unexpected nor truly bothersome to him. And I believe that my family is rushing the matter too much. I will take a husband eventually, but he will be of my own choosing, Rias said in turn. Standing and turning away, she crossed her arms. Riser stood in kind and irritation once again leaked onto his face. Even if it wasn't unexpected, Ria's continuous refusal to even entertain the thought clearly grated on the blonde's nerves. The two of them really acted more like children than people on the cusp of adulthood, and if Naruto read the almost imperceptible lines of Greyfia's face correctly, she agreed with him, though she would never say so in their presence. She had always been devoted to her duties in that way. Stealing a glance at his companion as Riser grabbed his fiancée by the chin and made her face him, made Kuroka's current state of mind obvious to him. It had been years since she had seen little Shirin, and he did not doubt that there was considerable amount of mixed feelings currently going through her mind. Relief, for knowing, finally truly knowing, that her sister had survived. Regret, for the way the two of them had parted and the fact that Shirin did not know what had truly forced her sister's hand and likely harbored less than positive feelings towards Kuroka now. Worry, for the reaction she would get when they would finally have time to talk, and buried beneath all of it, the glimmers of affections likely unseen by anyone else that looked. Snaking an arm around her waist, he lightly pulled her body against his in an attempt to show both affection and support, which earned a quick grateful glance before her focus once again rested on Shirin. Kuroka did love her younger sister, as both an older sister and, as she had once admitted to him on a late night some time after they had gotten to know each other better, in some ways also as a mother. Yakai may have long lifespans, but Kuroka was old enough that in the past, she could have been Shirin's mother in terms of age difference. Though such things had become exceptionally rare nowadays. When their mother had died, she had found herself fulfilling both roles. Well, it was a matter for later, after the two young devils had finished. You know, Rias, I am the face of the Phoenix Pillar. I will not continue suffering your disrespect or insults to my honor, Riser said, face now so close the two of them were almost touching, his hand still on Ria's chin. Turning a dismissive look on the Gremory peerage, he continued, I'll take you back to the underworld myself, even if it means burning all of your servants to ash. Demonic energy was increasingly filling the immediate surroundings of the two, the fire-flavored renewing energy unique to the Phoenix family and their namesake, and the dark power of destruction of the Baal, and now also Gremory. Drama and entertainment. Who was to say there was no potential in this meeting for some enjoyment? But even if a spat between the two held the possibility of being amusing, it would only delay his own and Kuroka's business further. Naruto threw a glance towards Greyfia and a silent conversation, involving an offer to handle the issue from his side and a polite refusal from hers. Later the gray-haired queen disrupted the building energies with her own. A nifty trick, though much harder to use against those with true control over their powers. Unlike the two powers she had disrupted, both clearly colored by the nature of their users' abilities, Greyfia's own lacked such an easily detectable marker. Instead there was only a deep cloying darkness, cold not in the way his own abilities sometimes were, but more in the absence of light and heat, the chill of shadow and darkness, and not of ice. Naruto could spot the goosebumps on most of the room's occupants and barely suppressed a small grin. He had trained her well, but Greyfia had always taken what she was taught further than others. Please calm yourselves, Lady Gremory, Lord Phoenix. As I am here in my king's stead, I do not intend to stand idly by should anything unfortunate occur, Greyfia interrupted. She had not raised her voice, but she did not need to. Both of the young purebloods clearly understood just what the outcome would be, should it really come to an altercation. Riser recovered his unflappable air rather quickly, his former irritation seemingly forgotten in the face of the danger he could potentially be in. He was accustomed to power, he and Rias both, even if they seemed to overestimate their own. When the mightiest queen says so, I have no choice but to oblige. If the two of you are unable to come to an accord and insist on your positions, you're welcome to settle the issue through a rating game, Greyfia continued, ignoring the quip. Rias seemed surprised at the opportunity, while her newest servant seemed a bit confused. As Ria's night started on an explanation of rating games, how some of them still did not know even this was beyond him, Riser's look went from unbothered to confident. As far as Naruto knew, Riser was the more experienced duelist between the two. Not surprising, seeing he was both older and didn't waste his time by going to school in the human world. I have played many a time and won almost as often. Well, you are not even an officially qualified player, Rias dearest, Riser said, the glance he sent Rias, indicating that he did not afford her any chance to actually win against him. Just to be certain, are these all of your servants, Rias? What if they are? Rias challenged, seemingly similarly confident in her chances, even if she had to know that realistically they were minuscule at best. Riser seemed to see her bluster for what it was and laughed in amusement, with undertones of pride and malice hidden beneath. With a snap of his fingers, a new magic circle appeared in the room, glowing with the orange demonic energy of the Phoenix Pillar. I have 15, in other words, a full set. A scream of flames later and 15 newcomers stood in the room, all of them girls, and most of them dressed in a way only Kuroko would call decent. Naruto couldn't quite hold back an eye roll. He should have honestly expected this. Beauty's 15 beautiful girls, unbelievable. Issei exclaimed in the ensuing silence. Of course the boy only cared about that. What else had he expected? No matter the numerical disadvantage, no matter that Naruto could feel that Issei was outclassed in terms of power by most of the newcomers. No, what mattered was only that they were girls and how they looked. Truly hopeless, and if he hadn't thought so already, the tears now streaming down the boy's face as he complained about the unfairness of it all certainly made that abundantly clear. Even Riser seemed disturbed by the sobbing going on, quietly asking Rias what it was all about. His dream is to form a harem. And if that wasn't quite frustration tinged with embarrassment in her voice, Naruto would give up all of his hard-earned wisdom of the shinobi arts. Ha! Is that so? Ubaluna. Riser exclaimed, calling his queen to his side. Gone was any semblance of the almost normal young man he had shown for just one moment, and in its place was once again the proud, if not arrogant Phoenix boy. Yes, Riser. The purple-haired young woman walked towards her king, stopped right in front of him, and then the two of them started making out right then and there. Riser obviously wasn't shy about the whole thing either, groping his servant with abandon, clearly putting on a show. Amusing as that was, however, seeing Greya having to almost physically restrain herself from putting a hand to her forehead to try and massage away the annoyance easily topped it. Judging by the frigid glance he earned from her a moment later, she knew that he was enjoying this and she would get him back for this later. A small genjutsu, made to allow the other occupants of the room to more easily ignore him and Kuroko, wouldn't stop anyone who was truly looking for them in particular. It did not stop Shirin from still having most of her focus on her sister either. You will never be able to do things like this, you lowly imp, Riser said, still fondling his servant while he addressed Issei. Shut up. I can tell you'll flirt with other girls even after marrying our president. You promiscuous chicken shit. Hearing that almost gave him whiplash. That was the boy's problem. Didn't Rias just say he dreamed of having a harem? How exactly did he think he'd get there? Judging by some of the glances Issei earned, Naruto wasn't the only one who thought the boy hadn't quite thought out the whole harem idea. Don't you know your place? Riser clearly didn't think it was quite as unimportant. Directing a blazing glare at the boy, his demonic energy started unintentionally climbing again. All I'm aware of is my position. Stop, Issei. As but you servant. Issei finished, seemingly truly angry with Riser. Left hand raised, a green glow enveloped the limb for a moment and then the boosted gear was revealed in all its glory. The red gauntlet inlaid with green jewels covered his entire forearm and hand, though even with his sacred gear, Issei himself wasn't a force even a well-trained human was incapable of overcoming. We don't need a stupid game. I'll bring all of you down right here. Boost. With a shout, Issei launched himself forward, Riser the obvious target. The blonde in comparison didn't seem concerned at all. If anything, he only got even more irritated. The only question was he irritated enough to outright kill the boy? Mira. From the back of the group of servants, a blue-haired staff-wielding girl rushed to intercept, stopping for one moment as Issei did the same. This small girl. I can't really attack her, Issei muttered under his breath. Before he had the time to even react, the small girl had struck him in the stomach with the end of her staff, launching him into the ceiling. So not only was the boy slow and weak, but he was also thoughtless and stupid. This was just great. At this rate he may actually feel bad if he was forced to kill the boy later on. A moment after the pity squad had arrived to fuss and worry, Issei fell unconscious. Obviously the chance that Rias would beat Riser in a rating game was even lower than Naruto had initially thought. Really, that is supposed to be the wielder of the boosted gear. Who knew he would be such a worthless guy, Riser said, unknowingly echoing his thoughts. Alright. Let's settle this with a rating game, Rias countered, her voice resolute as she lowered Issei back to the ground after quickly checking him over. Judging by the reactions in the room, her peerage wasn't quite on the same page as their king. Understood, preparations will be made to hold the game in 10 days' time. Ever dutiful, Greya ignored most of what had happened. With a chuckle, Riser turned towards his peerage, clearly intent on leaving now that his business was done. He didn't even break his stride as Rias addressed him again. Riser. I swear, I'll blast you away. I'm looking forward to it, my love, Riser answered, still unbothered. We'll meet again for the game then. Turning around, his peerage positioned to teleport away in a magic circle, Riser's taunting smirk was directed at only Rias. There was one little thing Naruto did want to say though. Remembering long blonde hair, a fire that had truly been indistinguishable from that of a phoenix, and quiet intimate moments centuries past. He had only said he wouldn't disrupt the meeting much, after all. Riser-kun. Just as the magic circle started expanding below their feet it stopped, or well, froze in place would be more apt. Now all eyes were on him. The small genjutsu he had woven to make them less obtrusive dispelled a moment before. Glancing at Greya for a moment, a silent apology in his eyes, even though he knew she had been tempted to do the exact thing he was about to do, Naruto focused on Riser. Son of a pillar and a pure blood you are, Riser, but whatever your personal inclination I do know your mother, Lady Layla, and I do know that she taught you manners. The more accomplished duelist and more powerful you may indeed be, but Rias is the heir to Pillar Gremory. I know that you know just what happens when this marriage goes through. As long as she acts within her station as heir she deserves the respect of that station. The Phoenix may be a powerful family, but Rias outranks yours and you are only a third son. At the last bit Naruto could see the twitch on Riser's face, however arrogant the boy may be he would not act now, even after something like that. He was not a complete fool. If you will not act as your station and name demand don't be surprised if you are treated as if you lack the very same. Tell your mother Snowfeather sends his regards. That will be all. Excuse my interruption, both of you, Naruto said, clear finality ringing in his voice and dismissing the Phoenix Devil from the room. The look on Riser's face was certainly complicated now and then the magic circle finally continued expanding and started to glow a bright orange. Irritation and anger were to be expected, confusion was a most likely result of the last part, but he could see at least some contemplation in the young devil's eyes. It may be enough. Naruto wouldn't get his hopes up however. Some people needed to get certain things beaten out of them and no amount of talking would suffice. After the magic circle was consumed in another cry of orange flames, only the Gremory peerage, Greya, Kuroka and himself remained in the room. Greya seemed intent on staying, even if her business was technically over, still a silent figure next to Ria's desk. Shirin and Kuroka were still mostly focused on each other, though he knew Kuroka at least still kept careful track of her surroundings. Issei still unconscious. The nun, Asia Argento, at his side already using what was obviously her sacred gear to heal his injuries, though he remained unconscious for now. Udo, still where he had been when the two of them had entered the room, carefully looking them over. Akeno, close to her king, quietly devoted and ready for anything. And Rias herself still next to Issei, though she had made some room when Asia had joined her, with her attention entirely on Naruto. Unsurprising really. She did know of him and his help with Akeno, though not much, and he had just kind of helped her out. Far be it from me to involve myself even further in the matters of devil nobility than I already have, but I will say it anyway. Haidu-san won't be doing a lot of talking for now after all. A quick frustrated glance at the sacred gear wielder and then he was focused on Rias again. I know your brother certainly doesn't show it, but your parents were never ones to hide their political acumen. Maybe Zeodicus and Venelana have grown soft after the Civil War, it wouldn't be the first time I have seen something like it, but I do doubt it. How old are you now, Rias? 18. Certainly old enough to start acting like an adult, or at the very least to try. One long suffering breath out and he continued. Having said that, I have to ask. Do you use your head for anything besides as a place to have that Gremory hair grow from? Judging by the perplexed look and slowly growing anger on her face the last thing Rias had expected were insults or a lecture. A few moments of silence later he kept going. Because, since you so clearly seem to be against the current arrangement between Pillars Gremory and Phoenix for whatever reason, and with the tools you do have access to, how is it that nothing has been done? That nothing seems to have changed? Or have you always gambled on the possibility that you will beat a stronger, more experienced opponent in a martial contest that was unlikely to be offered as an opportunity? Young and prideful you and Riser might be, but neither of you is that foolish. Even in a month's time your chances would still be too low to be a reasonable gamble. The look in Greya's eyes was clear. She may not approve of what he said or how he had said it, but she did agree. Which begged the question, if Greya and presumably Surziches were of the same mind as he was, why was nothing any different? Idiotic as Surziches could be, especially about his sister, he was not scared of acting, and he never had been. Zeodicus and Venelana then. Well, it was possible that Rias was alone in her disagreement with the arrangement. As much as her parents did care about her, and they truly did, that Naruto knew, maybe they simply saw the whole thing as necessary. Slight irritation bleeding into his voice at the continued silence, Naruto spoke, well. He gave her a look, demanding an answer from the Gremory heiress. Judging by the looks he was getting from the Gremory peerage they were not happy with him. Neither was the heiress herself for that matter. White knuckle grip on her arms, a tightening around her eyes and slowly rising demonic power. Definitely not happy. That you would disrespect me like this, in my own territory to boot. He wasn't about to give her any ground, not like this anyway. In the human world, among devils you may have partial ownership of the city, but I couldn't care less. At most angels and fallen would actually care about it, and I am neither, girl, Naruto countered sharply. Taking a deep breath he relaxed slightly. Frustration aside, this was neither helping nor truly fair. She was still a child in all the ways that mattered to him, and harping on about her foolishness as one was less than appropriate. Allowing children their foolishness was the duty of their elders, even if there was no familial connection between them. Be that as it may, I did not come here to discuss what you have or haven't done, and you are right in saying that it is in the end a private matter. This is neither truly the time or place for such a discussion. He lowered his head in apology. The fact that the demonic energy in the room had stopped increasing was indication enough that Rias was at least slightly mollified by his words. As I said, there is some business I have with you, or more accurately your pawn. However, there is another matter between us. A quick gesture of his hand towards Kuroka. Allow me to introduce Kuroka, formerly a bishop in the peerage of a member of Pillar Nibirius, and more importantly the elder sister of your rook, Shirin. Ignoring the looks they both received, he continued, his arm moving from one to the next as he introduced them: Rias Gremory, Akeno Himejima, Yudo Kiba, Asia Argento, Issei Haidu, and Greya Lucifuge. From the corner of his eyes he could see Kuroka measure up the different people one after another, lingering longer on Greya than the others, understandably. The reactions varied, but Rias and Shirin were the most obvious. While Shirin's more stoic expression faded into a compromise between some fear and anger, her king went from contemplation to indignation, even if she was still obviously apprehensive. She may not have known Kuroka personally before this, but she had undoubtedly known of her. SS-class stray devils were rare enough, and this one had a personal connection to one of her servants. Rias may not have identified Kuroka from appearance alone, especially when her more esoteric features were currently hidden, but with a name Rias was quick to catch on. The tension from before was eclipsed in an instant, even if Rias seemed entirely aware of what she was up against, and how compared to this, her chances against Riser were incredibly high, that clearly did not deter her. Her hand engulfed in her power of destruction and her crimson locks waving in the slight winds being produced by the flaring of her power, Rias cut quite a striking figure. Proud stance, one hand raised in front of her rook, as if to shield her, Rias appeared ready for combat. You are aware that Kuroka is a wanted stray devil. I am aware that she was labeled as such, but whatever her status, that is not what she is here for, Naruto answered, not at all bothered. Glancing at Kuroka he invited her to explain herself. I don't intend to harm anyone here, little Rias. I only want to talk to my sister. Judging by their expressions the others either didn't believe Kuroka, didn't really have enough context to understand what was going on, or simply didn't care. Giving them a moment of thought as Rias relaxed her magical power slightly, Naruto forged on. We only ask that you consider, Shirin, Rias. Seeing their nods, even if they were a bit hesitant, he turned his attention to Issei, still unconscious on the ground where he had landed, though his injuries were completely healed. Well, that wouldn't do. Giving Kuroka's hands a small squeeze, Naruto stood up. Ignoring the looks he got, he walked over to the unconscious pawn. Crouching down opposite of Asia he looked over the boy. There was a lot of things you could tell even by only superficially inspecting a body. A youthful face, still clearly showing signs of the boy's young age. An untrained body, no signs of true muscle mass, the hands of a civilian and a body that was still, well, awkward. The boy was still in that weird stage of puberty, where your limbs weren't quite proportioned right, though he was clearly growing out of it. A year, two at most, and that at least would have changed. All in all, nothing impressive. Focusing for a moment on the boy's left hand, free of the red gauntlet he had summoned before, revealed some other information to Naruto. He could feel Drag awake in the boosted gear, possibly aware of his presence, and the dragon likely knew why Naruto was here. He could also feel the connection between the sacred gear and Issei. Weak and fragile still, a result of the recent awakening of the gear no doubt. He had interacted with every single wielder of the boosted gear and divine dividing, which made detecting certain things simpler. If you knew what could be, it was easier to discern what was. Looking up at the nun on the other side of Issei, still quietly worried about the boy even if she knew that he was no longer injured, he met a face full of innocence underlaid with that stubborn determination to help common and those that called the healing arts their own. Tsunade herself had exhibited the same, even if it was often buried under mountains of grief or more often frustration, especially when Jiraiya had been involved. Gesturing towards Issei he addressed the nun, acutely aware that the whole peerage were watching him like hawks, still suspicious of his intentions and actions. May I? It seemed to take a moment before the blonde girl understood what he meant, followed by a short considering look. Maybe she wasn't quite as naive as she first appeared. At her nod of acceptance he flicked a glance upwards, where Rias was standing close behind her bishop. Seeing the redeed echo the gesture after a moment of thought, Naruto quickly considered his options. He needed the boy awake and he was unconscious. There were several ways to rectify that, but which to choose? He may not like any of the things he had seen of the boy until now, but Issei hadn't really done anything to personally earn his ire, so there wasn't any real reason to be overly mean now. Slowly, he placed 2 fingers on the boy's forehead. The slightest sliver of chakra escaped him, telling him more than he had been able to discern before. The evil pieces inside him, their current state, Issei's truly pitiful magical reserves and his sacred gear. But that was for later. He had dealt with enough injuries in his long life. Waking someone from unconsciousness, especially since there weren't any remaining physical ailments to consider, was more than simple. A small quiet spark probed at the boy's mind, bringing him on the path to wakefulness. Removing his hand, Naruto stood and made some room. Issei started to stir, and the other members of the peerage quickly crowded around the slowly waking pawn. Issei. Relief rang clearly in their voices, even if it was still shadowed by apprehension. Naruto could not blame them for it, none of them truly knew him after all. He allowed them a few moments of fussing and scolding, mostly filled with confusion for Issei, the boy not quite remembering just what had happened before he fell unconscious. If you are finished, there is something I meant to get to. The All-Father knows that we have already wasted enough time. After a bit of confusion, talking and explanations, they were seated again. Rias and Issei on one couch, Naruto on the opposite one and Greya standing to the side but between them. Ria's peerage were standing behind her, while Kuroka was still sitting on the conjured couch to the side of the room. Ideally Shirin and Kuroka could have talked right now, but Rias allowing that conversation without Greya there to stop anything unfortunate from happening was not possible. Of course Kuroka didn't intend anything like that, but Rias had neither any reason to trust that intent, nor was she foolish enough to allow it despite that. Since Greya served a similar function in this conversation and she couldn't be in 2 places at once, the conversation between sisters would have to wait. Sipping at the tea Keno had prepared before, even if it had gone cold in the meantime, Naruto eyed Issei. The boy still seemed a bit confused, understandably, and quietly unsettled, probably a result of both the whole situation and their interaction at the beginning. After letting him squirm for a bit longer, Naruto set down the cup. It really is quite good tea. Keno bowed in thanks while Naruto continued. Issei Haidu, you are the current wielder of the boosted gear. If you do not yet know what that entails, I will tell you now. He had the raptive attention of the whole room now. I have interacted with every known wielder of the boosted gear and divine dividing, and in total the most lethal thing to those people has not been each other or anything else, but me. He could see the children react, first with surprise and then slowly dawning horror, as they understood the implications of what he had said. Before any complaints were spoken, he raised his hand, asking for their silence for now and continued, which is not say that I have slaughtered them for simply existing. I have done with them as I am currently doing with you, tried to talk and to determine whether action on my part is necessary. As long as you do not give me cause to act, we will have no quarrel with each other. That seemed to placate everyone, even if only slightly. So Haidu-san, you find yourself in the position of harboring the dragon of domination, what then do you intend to do? What are your ambitions? What is it that drives you deep down? For a moment it honestly seemed like Issei was seriously considering his questions. Glancing around, his eyes landed on his king, earning an encouraging nod from her before his focus shifted slightly. A moment of thought later he answered. I want to keep my friend safe, I guess. I want to help, but you, and when Issei failed to continue, Naruto interrupted. What else then? Spit it out. Issei started, beginning to shake, his hands balled into fists in front of him. I will become a harem king. Issei shouted, fist raised to the sky, his eyes focused to the side, on what was clearly his king's chest. Most of the others reacted like they were already used to this, exasperation clear on their faces. Pervert, Shirin muttered from behind, disgust audible in her voice. And is that a dragon's greed, a teenager's foolishness, or a personal inclination talking? Naruto wasn't impressed or dissuaded. The whole thing may seem innocent, but as long as he didn't know just what Issei was ready to do to achieve his dreams, he wouldn't take the chance, any chance. If anything, Issei seemed honestly affronted by his question. Dragging his eyes away from their previous target seemed to take extraordinary effort, but the boy still looked at Naruto, as if he was the odd one in this situation. How could you ever ask such a question? To be surrounded by wonderful day and night, to bask in their presence, what greater dream could there be? Fist raised in front of his face, his eyes almost seemed to sparkle as he continued. A small sneer on Shirin's face spoke of disgust, and the others weren't much better, though more along the lines of shock and embarrassment. This is just wonderful, isn't it? The boy seemed ready to keep up his tirade for the whole day, no doubt further devaluing him in the eyes of most females in the vicinity if he did. At least this part seemed honestly personal. Before you make more of a fool of yourself than you already have, I would advise that you listen to what I say. A small spike of his killing intent shut Issei up again. In any case, my true target in this whole affair is Drake himself and not you directly. As you are the current owner of the boosted gear, you not only wield some of his power, but you are also the easiest possible path for Drake to escape his confinement. That is what I will stop, no matter the fashion that he tries to accomplish it in. Live your life free of actions that would enable that in any way, and you will have no quarrel with me. Shrugging his shoulders, Naruto continued, cold steel in his voice. Should you, on the other hand, aid Drake in any way, and I do stress any way, then I will stop you in that possibility in whatever manner I see fit. I promise you, no amount of distance or power, no matter your connections or the possible consequences to my own person in the aftermath, will be able to stop me from carrying out that task. I assure you, I have grown incredibly proficient at it over the centuries. It was more than an hour later that Naruto and Kuroko left the building, Greya trailing next to them. For now they remained in silence. Naruto didn't know if Greya had something specific she wanted or if she was simply making sure that they really did leave before she did so herself, but he didn't say anything for now. He hadn't been in the room with Kuroko and Shirin, but it was obvious that Kuroko was still contemplating what had been said between the two sisters. Halfway across the grounds it was Greya that broke the silence, her red eyes trained on him and her amusement plain. So, snow feather? Greya asked, suppressed laughter in her voice. Ugh, Naruto groaned. I knew I shouldn't have said anything. Even though he was looking at Greya, Naruto could feel Kuroko's attention move to the conversation. What, embarrassed now? I didn't realize there was reason to doubt the Phoenix lineage, Greya said, one hand raised to cover her open mouth in mock surprise. I should have never told you that story, he muttered under his breath. Oh? Sounded from behind him, Kuroko breaking her silence at hearing what sounded like juicy teasing material. Naruto couldn't quite stop himself from rolling his eyes and explained. I've had, well, let's call it interactions with Pillar Phoenix for almost as long as the pillars exist, and, Naruto began before he was interrupted by Greya, a teasing grin visible. Well, that answered everything. And got to know Layla one of those times. It was a relatively calm period at the end of your civil war and we happened to meet. She was part of the few extra demons of Pillar Phoenix, though most of them don't exist anymore, he continued, unwilling to subject himself to more teasing. We spent some time together, but her family had been considering matches for her for a while already. Eventually they found a suitable one. Marrying into the Phoenix from their clan. Her family would have been fools to decline. We stayed good friends afterwards, but I haven't seen her for a while. I'm not even sure she'll still remember me, it's been at least 100 years since we last met. Well, as long as we don't have to worry about any of Riser's siblings spontaneously manifesting the ability to cause an ice age, I guess it's not important for now. You're too kind, Naruto deadpanned in response. He heard Kuroko suppressing giggles. Naturally, as the wife of Lucifer and a daughter of Lucifuge, it is only proper that my gracious nature shine through, while talking to those of lesser standing, Greya answered, the faux haughty tone she used unusually playful for her normal standards. Naruto could only chuckle quietly, shortly joined by Greya herself. Really, where did the boy learn that stuff? I don't think even Zekrom was this bad at his worst. The merry silence between them lasted a few seconds longer before they reached the gate. All three of them stopped and waited. Greya clearly had something she wanted, and it seemed now was the time she would get to the more serious matters. So, how did you do it? As far as I knew, it wasn't possible in the first place. She had noticed then. He had expected as much. Oh, it wasn't quite as complicated as I initially assumed. Ajuka may have done a good job designing them, but in the end, I've had more than a few centuries to theorize and experiment. His left hand reached towards his pocket, bringing out the object concealed within. Greya had followed the movement with her eyes and immediately zeroed in on the black chess piece now held in his hand. The bishop piece looked like any other ordinary chess piece, but all three of them could feel that while it was entirely inert right now, it had not been this way in the past. Instead of the demonic energy usually exuded by an evil piece, this one only gave the passive impression of the same thing. Like the energies formerly contained within had left behind an imprint in the piece that even now colored its existence to a slight degree. Turning the bishop between his fingers a few times, Naruto handed it to Kuroko. That's the one I could recover, the other one didn't take the process as well. It turned to dust upon exit. Shrugging his shoulder to make it clear that he didn't particularly care about that turn of events, Naruto continued. As for how exactly it is done, it's a complicated process better discussed in different circumstances. What Greya did not know she could not be asked to reveal. Asking her to lie about or conceal things like that for his sake was not something he was in the habit of doing. Would you make it clear to any enthusiasts what the consequences of continued action will be? Greya simply nodded her head. Easily accepting the warning hidden within his words. She knew where his priorities were. Naruto did not doubt that she had understood the moment he and Kuroko had entered together. For a few moments silence reigned between them. All three of them reflecting on certain events of the day. He was the one that broke the silence this time. "How long do you give Rias?" "3 days at the latest," Greya answered immediately, her tone matter of fact. That earned her raised eyebrows from him and Kuroka both. "Oh? Really? I was about to say 5 days myself." She seemed more prideful than that. "Something we should know about little Rias." Kuroka interjected for the first time, an impish grin growing on her face, maybe a fixation on light hair. At the last part her attention shifted to him, or more specifically his hair, for a moment. But then, how would we explain her queen? "I don't think she has enough pieces for that kind of conclusion yet." "It could still be Japanese names though," Naruto pondered in a similar, slightly mocking tone of voice. "If that is case we will have to look out and prepare, maybe Rias seeks to claim both of us as pieces," he continued. The faux serious expression on his face coupled with his tone made Greya sigh in defeat. Perhaps they were onto something here. Greya would know after all. "Anyway, do you still have work to do or are you free for today, Greya?" While talking Naruto had already turned to exit the gate, Kuroka at his side. He turned his head back towards her as he fished for the key in his pocket. Greya pondered his question for a moment, clearly juggling her many duties before coming to a conclusion. "Other than informing Surziches of how everything went today, there is nothing particularly pressing." "What did you have in mind?" "Well, we were planning to visit a hot spring." "Want to join us?" Naruto asked. Stopping in front of the car he opened the door for Kuroka before glancing back at Greya. Seeing her hesitate slightly he rolled his eyes and added on, "You can call Surziches from the car if it's this pressing, or meet us there if you want. I'll give you the address." "Great, now I owe Greya drinks," Naruto thought. After they had talked about it a bit more 3 days ago the two of them had made a bet. He had been reasonably sure that Rias would take longer to seek him out. Seems like he would have to pay up. The only sounds in the study were the scratching of a pen on paper and the occasional turning of a page. A few minutes were spent in that relative silence, both occupants largely focused on themselves. 2 pages of paper later Naruto released a sigh of relief, putting aside the last of the paperwork, now finally finished. Checking all of the pages one last time he started filing them away. Satisfied with his work and somewhat grateful he was done, Naruto leaned back in his chair. As soon as he had sensed Ria's move into the vicinity he had prepared himself for a conversation, which had included moving to this room. Kuroka had joined him not long after, most likely for her own amusement. However, Rias did not seem particularly inclined to actually knock or ring the doorbell or do anything else besides stand outside. For the last 30 minutes. What exactly she was thinking about he didn't know, though he could guess, but for now there was nothing to do but wait. Kuroka, currently seated in a comfortable armchair with a book in her lap, still seemed engrossed in her reading. Which was honestly surprising. He had almost done a double take when Kuroka had taken out a book at all. Usually she believed that napping was a much better way to spend her time. Getting up from his desk Naruto walked towards Kuroka and took a seat in one of the other chairs. Leaning back he started pondering what exactly he would do. Rias was going to ask for something or she wouldn't have come. Either she had decided herself that she needed help or she had asked for advice from Greya who in turn had mentioned the possibility of asking him. In either case Rias would ask for assistance of some kind as soon as she fully convinced herself to ring the bell. He had not been exaggerating when he had called her chances against Riser minuscule. Riser held the edge in experience, personal ability, manpower, and an overall combat ability. Even if most of his pieces were relatively weak by themselves, he still had a full set of them. Even if Ria's pieces all had the advantage in personal strength and they did not, it would still have been difficult to win, though definitely more possible than it currently was. The Keno may be able to equal either Ravel or Riser's queen in strength, and Kaneko and Kiba could probably handle both of their opposites on their own, but Asia was only useful in a supporting role, Ria's other bishop wasn't available, and Issei, well. The boy had taken up all of Ria's pawns, but at the moment was weaker than all of Riser's by themselves. Maybe he could take care of 2 of them, 3 in a best case scenario, but that still left Rias with the problem of 2 bishops, 5 pawns, a queen and Riser himself against her with a Keno and Asia as support. So what exactly were her options? With her current pieces, Rias needed to focus on overwhelming smaller groups of Riser's pieces with larger numbers or firepower of her own. Cut those numbers any way she could. Divide and conquer. Normally an impossible task in a raiding game. Riser didn't need to do anything, wasn't forced to act in any way that would allow Rias to apply such tactics. He didn't need to defend any positions, he didn't need to accomplish any secondary objectives. The only thing Riser needed to do was wait. Stay as a group in an open field, set up a simple barrier, and wait. However, if Riser were willing to wait this whole situation probably wouldn't be happening at all. Ugh, finally. I thought she was gonna stay out there the whole day. Throwing an amused look at Kuroka as she closed her book, Naruto rose from his chair. He had felt Rias seemingly resolve herself and start moving towards them just as much as Kuroka had. Would you get the door while I make some tea? Naruto asked, already moving towards the kitchen. Most of the things he cooked tended to land on the military ration side of things when it came to taste, but an enjoyable cup of tea was not beyond his abilities. Bringing the water to a boil with a bit of fire chakra, Naruto could hear Kuroka move to the door and open it moments before Rias could knock or ring the bell. After some quick greetings, the two of them moved towards the study Kuroka and Naruto had just left. A minute of finishing the tea and also giving Kuroka some time to ask about Keko later, Naruto joined them, placing the tea on a desk in the middle. "So, to what do we owe the pleasure, Rias?" Leaning back, Naruto sipped his tea and continued. "Or is this simply a social call?" Rias spent a few seconds simply sitting there and sampling her tea. Neither Kuroka nor Naruto interrupted her, confident that she would start explaining soon. Seemingly rallying her thoughts, Rias squared her shoulders, put down her cup and started talking. "After you all left 3 days ago, I immediately started setting up training for my peerage to prepare against Riser. There has already been some good progress, but even with it I am not satisfied. Embracing the opportunity I have is an obvious illusion." That does present an issue." His tone suggested Naruto wasn't actually particularly bothered by this. "So why come here?" Ria's confused look made him elaborate. "First, you barely know me." Raising a finger with each point he made, he continued. "Second, I have no desire to help the wielder of the boosted gear in any way, shape or form. Third, if your goal was assistance, why not ask Sona, who calls you friend, Greya, who is as close to family to you as she could be, or your brother, who would be here assisting you before you had even finished asking. Fourth, even if I did agree to help, what could I accomplish in 3 maybe 4 days? Learning even the basics of combat effectively can take weeks even for a gifted student." The thought alone made him shake his head. Point out and fix some flaws, correct faulty habits, maybe even help develop or teach some other applications of magic. Sure, I could do that, but even all of that won't assure your victory. Lastly, your biggest problems are not something I can help you with. You simply lack the numbers for a real chance at victory. All that said, why come here? Of course, it was pretty obvious why. Rias had her pride, too much of it really. Asking her family or a good friend for help would mean admitting to herself that she could not solve the problem alone. But to ask a relative stranger with known capabilities? That would just be her taking the initiative and using her own resources to accomplish her goals. Certainly 2 completely different scenarios. But would Rias admit it? A moment of surprised silence and Rias answered. "I may not know you personally, but I have talked to Greya. While I may not fully know your capabilities, I know those of my brother. Considering what she told me, asking you for this matter promises to be just as effective," Rias countered, and as she talked, she seemed to regain some of the bravado from the last time they met. A nonchalant shrug and she continued. "Issei is already making good progress, your assistance would be better used elsewhere in any case. What help he needs, I or one of the others can easily provide. Both my brother and Sona would be acting outside their stations if it was known they came to my assistance. I would not want to inflict that risk upon them. I'm convinced that, even considering the remaining time, your help is more than sufficient in raising my chances of victory. As to the problem of numbers." The coy expression Rias sported as she revealed a black chess piece brimming with demonic energy seemed to be an attempt at seduction, if an unpracticed one. Quite brazen of her, really, with Kuroka in the room. Though it was possible Greya had given her the idea to do him a mischief if nothing else. The tall figure Rias twirled between her fingers only vaguely resembled a knight piece and looked more like a demented attempt at portraying one, which was the most obvious clue to its nature as a mutation piece. Naruto did not spare the chess piece more than a glance. Even if he were interested in what she was proposing, Rias did not seem to truly comprehend the circumstances. She claimed to have some knowledge of his capabilities, but it didn't seem like she truly understood it. Well argued for one your age. However, there are some misunderstandings that should be cleared up. A gesture towards the mutation piece. "Even using that, you could not reincarnate me. The number of devils capable of the feat I can probably count on 2 hands, and you, quite frankly, are nowhere close. That is without even mentioning that I have no interest in becoming a devil." Waving a dismissive hand to change the topic, Naruto continued. "There is also the fact that I have no desire to directly participate in games intended only to appease the pride of a devil, those that would involve me beating up children even less so." He could read the disagreement in the set of Ria's shoulders, but for now she allowed him to continue. Kuroka similarly seemed willing to throw something in, but was waiting for him to make his point. "You claim Issei is making good progress, and I have no reason to doubt your word. But what difference do you think it will make? The boy was a normal human until you reincarnated him. How much combat has he seen since then? As pathetically weak as he is right now, you could train a month and he would only barely be worth the pieces you needed to use to acquire him in the first place," Naruto said. "Be fair, she is still a child at heart, despite her age. That said, I do not have the same insight into the strengths and weaknesses of the involved parties that you do. If you are still willing to stake your chances on this attempt, then that is your choice to make. I do not wish to interfere directly, but I can offer 2 pieces of, well, wisdom. Use them as you see fit. Naruto raised an index finger. On one condition. Rias straightened at hearing that. Conditions. She would do well to pay attention if she wanted to agree to anything. Even if he had no intent to trick her so directly, being attentive to these matters was basically second nature to devils. Apprehensive as Rias might be, her voice did not waver. What condition? In exchange, I want you to explain. What are your plans moving forward, win or lose? Why do you resist your situation and why do you do it in this way? In this instance I seek truth. Teeth visible, the edges of his mouth raised in a mockery of smirk that was as human as the other occupants of the room. Are you willing to offer it? Rias was clearly wary, as she should be. Truth. What did that give him beyond the obvious? What did he seek to gain from that? She couldn't know, and that meant the potential ramifications were unclear. Dangerous ground to step onto. There was also the fact that Rias did not have anything else to offer. His own resources outmatched her own by far, even if she was not necessarily aware of that fact. Yes. Judging by the resolute expression on her face, she really was sure, so much that even his focus on her did not deter her. Good, at least making difficult decisions did not seem to take her long. The future would show if she would accept the consequences of those decisions as well. If you have not done so yet, unseal the other evil pieces in Issei. That threw Rias for a loop. As serious as she had become over the last minutes, his words had clearly unbalanced her. Wah, he won't be able to handle it. All 8 of them will overwhelm him immediately. Will they? What makes you so sure? I do not know what insight you have into the workings of the evil pieces. From what I have gathered over the centuries, a normal human would be quickly overwhelmed by 8 pawns, but a normal human would never need 8 pawns. Issei did. Don't underestimate the effect that a sacred gear has on the body, especially because Issei was born a plain human. Don't unseal them all at once if you are wary of the consequences, but unseal them nonetheless. Hour wasn't the issue, Issei was weak by all accounts. Sacred gears had other effects on the body, especially on plain humans. Hybrids tended to show only diluted effects, but sacred gears imparted a certain resilience on their wielders. It wasn't actual physical toughness, but their being was simply less prone to being overwhelmed, especially from within. A bit of consideration and Rias nodded in acceptance, even if she was clearly reluctant. That worry he knew all too well, one of the features that spoke well of Rias as a king, a future pillar, and as a person. He had seen it on the members of her family often enough, not to mention in a mirror. Feeling responsible for others was something they all had in common. I can also assist with planning. I don't know how far you have come, but I am willing to advise on tactics and strategy if you want me to. Standing up, Naruto moved to the desk and gestured for the other 2 to join him. Taking out a sheet of paper, he started writing down names in 2 columns, Rias and her peerage on one side and Riser and his peerage on the other, members opposed on the other side by their equivalent pieces. How do you? Rias muttered, focused mainly on one name on her side of the page. Gasper Vladi. Why was obvious, her first bishop was sealed in a part of the academy she visited every day. Naruto only gave her an amused glance. The girl overestimated her ability to keep things secret. Once all the names were arrayed on the page, Naruto crossed out Gasper and straightened, focused on Rias standing on the opposite side of the desk. For a moment he could see some worry in her eyes, looking at the odds she faced, but she once again firmed herself and matched his gaze. Hiroka had instead taken a seat on the corner of the desk off to the side, only giving the sheet of paper a cursory look before fixing him with a mischievous grin, one matched by an answering one of his own. He was pretty sure he knew what Hiroka intended to add when he was done and could not blame her. Her influence would be harder to pin down than his own in any case. What do you know? Naruto asked. About what? About the match-ups. Naruto gestured to the paper. The battlefield, the conditions the match will take place under. What is your analysis of the facts as you know them? Your biggest problem is obvious. Riser's numbers advantage. What do you plan to do about it? Placing another empty paper next to the one containing the names, he extended a pencil her way. Quietly accepting the writing utensil, Rias started thinking aloud, now and then scribbling down points. I will have to keep Asia with me. She has no real combat abilities, so she will be safest at my side. I'll send out Keko, with Issei. Have them distract a group. 4, maybe more. Akeno will use that time to prepare, hit all of them with one big attack while they're distracted. Kiba will go alone, find anybody that's split up, maybe one of Riser's knights. When Kiba wins. If Kiba wins, Naruto objected. Trust in allies was all well and good, but Rias was the commander on the field. She had to consider every possibility. If she didn't, her peerage would suffer for it. When Kiba wins, he will seek out other stragglers. Rias countered stubbornly, as if the suggestion alone was some kind of offense. Shaking his head, Naruto re-evaluated how much success he would be able to have here as Rias continued. Kuroka only threw him another amused glance, hiding her grin behind one hastily raised hand. At least one of them was enjoying this. If there are any injuries I'll have them gather to me so Asia can take care of them. Akeno will take on Yubaluna. Keko and Issei can then search out any other groups. Keko will win against either of Riser's rooks and Issei will be ready to take on multiple pawns on his own if there are any left at all. A satisfied smile on her face, Rias pondered the rest of the pieces. Ravel, both of Riser's knights and rooks, and Riser himself. Both of the knights would present similar challenges, as would the rooks. Preparing plans for either of the two pairs being present at the end would be wise. Toying with the pencil for a moment more, Rias drew a line below her current set of notes, separating all following notes from those she had made previously. Then, I'll have us regroup. Together we will be stronger than Riser's remaining forces. Send Kiba and Keko against their counterparts. Issei will be with me and Asia. He can protect Asia and support me against Riser if it comes to it. Akeno will take on Ravel. After a moment of thought that Rias clearly spent imagining the face-off she had outlined while tapping the pencil against the page, she grimaced and made a small correction. Ravel may be young, but she is quite strong. Akeno won't be able to beat her easily after taking out Yubaluna. But if she can distract her it won't matter. Once Riser is beaten the match is over anyway. Checking over her notes once more, a small but satisfied smile on her face, Rias put down the pencil, obviously happy with her outline of the coming events and her implied odds of winning. Pity he had to ruin it. Is that it? Is that your analysis? Your grand strategy to win your freedom from a fate you refuse to accept? Because if that was it, this whole thing is even more hopeless than I thought. An edge to his tone and ignoring Ria's sputtering, Naruto reached across the table, turned the paper around, and started correcting. If you act as you have outlined, you cannot win. Even if we assume that Riser will act as you predict, the matchups as you have set them up won't all go your way. The chance that Akeno simply beats Yubaluna is slim to none. If those two fight, either Yubaluna wins or the fight will last a while. Yubaluna has the edge in experience and reserves. Shaking his head, Naruto continued, voice still sharp. Granted, there is reason for any devil to fear Barakiel's lightning, but that alone is no guarantee of victory. In theory your idea to use Akeno to eliminate Riser's weaker pieces in numbers is sound, but what happens during that? If Issei, Shirin and Akeno are needed to take care of 5 or more weaker pieces, how would you manage all of Riser's other pieces while that is happening? Rias hesitated, looking a little overwhelmed. Riser may be arrogant and act foolishly, but he is not a complete fool, Naruto continued, giving Rias a meaningful look. He has taken part in raiding games multiple times. Even if he does underestimate you, which is likely, simply letting you do as you wish would be being willfully blind. Issei may be capable of performing as you predict or he may not. My experience with the boosted gear tells me it is unlikely, but you know Issei much better than I do. However, going from his first, quite frankly embarrassing performance against the weakest of Riser's pieces to, as you predict, beating not only one or two, but outmatching multiple of them together. Not a chance. He does not have the ability, he does not have the experience, and most importantly I question whether or not he has the will. You underestimate Issei. He has performed admirably when he has been in a fight, even if he is still new to the supernatural, Rias argued, arms crossed and frowning, the very picture of stubbornness. And what has he fought in those instances? Strays, likely on the monster side of being, and fallen that had not only killed him personally, but also hurt those he cares for. Monsters of his own imagination in all the ways that matter. Not normal-looking young women that have never personally done him such a grievance. Naruto ignored Ria's surprised look at his knowledge. He had inspected Issei, even if only briefly. The kind of damage to the soul that dying and being reincarnated did was unmistakable. He may not be able to directly interface with it under normal circumstances, but detecting such anomalies in the soul's condition was easy enough. Fight them? He certainly will. Especially if they attack your other pieces first. But to finish them off. To inflict damage that could be fatal. One moment of doubt, of hesitation, and he could open not only himself, but all of you up for a devastating defeat. Looking at Rias, Naruto's gaze was sharp. He had seen greenhorns in their first battles. Whether it was New Genin or any of the people he had met in the long time he had spent in this world. Expecting them to perform to such high levels would not bring about good results. Judging by Ria's expression, she was still willing to argue. If you do not believe me, that is your choice, but you have been warned. There is no need to further discuss it. At this point most of Ria's notes had been crossed out or annotated. Tapping the unaddressed peerage members listed on the other page, Naruto carried on. Keeping Asia safe is likely wise, but keeping her sheltered won't be helpful in the short or long term. Her sacred gear has incredible regenerative abilities, and only using them when it is absolutely safe would be a waste. Keep her out of direct combat if you must, but not out of the fight. After a small pause he continued. Shirin is important in your strategy since she does outmatch Riser's rooks. Especially if she gets a little help. Naruto threw a meaningful glance towards Kuroka before finishing. Using her and Kiba well will be the factor that wins or loses you the match. Taking that as her signal, Kuroka spoke up. I can train Shirin if you agree, little Rias. Rias seemed to exert some effort to swallow her reflexive response, which was likely to be negative. Instead, she presented a reasonable counter. Keko isn't ready for Senjutsu. Shirin-chan isn't ready for that yet, Kuroka agreed. But I can teach her other things. It will be more than you will be able to do for her in the time that's left. Rias, unsurprisingly, looked neither convinced nor happy. You should make a decision soon, the more time she has the bigger the benefits to Shirin, Naruto threw in. After glancing over the papers one last time he slid both of them towards Rias. There is still some things we need to go over for your game, but I'll give you a moment to decide. Moving around the room, Naruto collected the abandoned teacups still scattered on the desk before moving to the door, Kuroka a few steps behind. When he had closed a door behind him he applied a quick and simple seal, blocking off sound. Leaning against a nearby wall he released a deep sigh, a mix of frustration and resignation. She is hopeless, Naruto said. His dry tone earned him an amused giggle from Kuroka as she moved next to him. Oh, don't be so negative, she could still accept, Kuroka said, patting his arm in consolation. Before Naruto could respond the two were interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing, specifically originating from his pants. I gotta take care of this, could you take the cups? He asked, already handing off the filled tray to Kuroka as he gestured to the origin of the noise. From the corner of his eye he could see the mischievous grin on her face as she accepted the objects. I could take care of it with you much easier, but if you'd rather do it alone. The quick glance at the displayed contact information told him this was a business call. Naruto could only roll his eyes as he raised a phone to his ear, Kuroka and her priorities. Give me 5 minutes, you sex-crazed deviant. When Rias is gone we can get to that again. Kuroka only stuck out her tongue while moving away, an extra sway to her hips as she disappeared around the corner. Releasing a snort of amusement, Naruto turned away and moved towards another room while accepting the call. What's the situation? It's delicate, I'd rather tell you all the important details in person, the female voice on the other side answered. What can you tell me now? He asked. He hadn't heard of anything big happening, but if it was very recent the news wouldn't have traveled from Europe all the way to Japan yet. Somebody broke in, got away with important stuff. We need to know who, why, and where the stuff is. The higher-ups want it back yesterday. Is that enough information for you? Enough for now. I'll see what I need when I'm there. They want me there officially, or is this just a personal request? You always had to make sure to avoid awkward situations if nothing else. Official business, though Strada is still trying to convince everyone of that. You can come in the normal way. Juggling travel times in his head, Naruto thought for a moment. I can be there this evening. There is still some things I have to take care of here, he stated. Getting to Europe wouldn't take long, but getting to Italy and into the Vatican would take some time. He had to finish up here first. I'll have someone come pick you up. I'll see you there. With that Naruto ended the call. Turning around he could see a serious look on Kuroka's face. An uncommon sight. Seems like that's gonna have to wait a few days, Naruto said while moving towards her, an apologetic look on his face as he accepted her extended hand. He gave a gentle squeeze as they moved towards Rias, fingers threaded together. I'll be gone a few days, but I should be back in time to watch the game. Kuroka gave him a quizzical look. We are invited. No. Not yet, he answered, a small grin on his lips, matched by Kuroka a moment later. The amusement shared by the two only left them when they once again sat with Rias. She had both pages of paper in front of her, now joined by a third that she had made additional notes on while alone. What have you decided? Who has access to this place normally? Naruto asked, crouched down and inspecting the ground in front of the vault doors. There are 10 cardinals with the necessary access to open the vault. Naruto's only acknowledgement was a quiet hum. Straightening he moved around the entrance while inspecting the walls and ceiling. How do they gain access? He asked after a bit of searching. Moving to the actual doors, still in the open position they had been found in, he started looking at both the doors and lock. I can't tell you. That was to be expected, though not helpful. Is it some kind of biological key, a special ritual that only they know, or an actual object that could be obtained? Naruto clarified. As far as he could tell the doors were undamaged, as was the locking mechanism. He could hear her hand smooth down her robe, a habit she tended to exhibit when wording her answers carefully. The two of them were the only ones currently present, the guard stationed here reluctantly moving to the entrance outside, mostly so they could speak more freely, but also so that he could inspect everything in peace. The only magical traces he could detect were used for the locking of the vault. But that alone spoke volumes. What was still left felt like what it was, an open lock. Even inspecting it multiple times didn't turn up any of the signs that would indicate someone had forced their way in. No, the vault had been opened the normal way. The magic used in locking it was still there, not shredded or ripped apart or even circumvented in any way, just in what he would call its open state. A special ritual, only those 10 cardinals know it. It is taught from one to the next when the mantle is passed on. What he had expected, though there was still one thing to clear up. Turning around to face his companion, he saw her inspecting the surroundings, looking for clues just like he had done, though it seemed she hadn't been able to glean anything crucial yet. When was the last time it was opened? Naruto asked. Griselda raised a hand to her chin and thought, staring off into space, obviously trying to recall all the relevant information. It's been 6 months. I can make an inquiry later if it's crucial, she answered after a moment. That won't be necessary, if that's the time frame we are dealing with. I have all that I need from here. That is quite impressive, she said, a polite smile on her face. It didn't sound like Griselda was doubting him, but he still felt like he wasn't exactly being taken by his word. Not that that was uncommon. Griselda Corda tended to put up a polite front in all situations, even if she disagreed or hated your guts. Didn't stop her from slaughtering her enemies in cold blood either. One viper of a woman. I can't tell you who did it exactly, and the why is only conjecture at this point, but the how is pretty clear now. Gesturing to their surroundings, he began explaining. I can neither see nor sense any actual damage to the doors or the lock and its mechanism. That tells me that this, he pointed at the open vault, was open normally. Additionally, the floor in front shows the marks that would occur when such a ritual occurs, and they are fresh. If the last time this was opened was about 6 months ago, they shouldn't be like this. Crouching down again, he waved to Griselda to join him and indicated the floor. On it were faint scratches and marks. That darker one at the front, I would guess a simple lamp or some other light source. This one, the slight layer of dust on the ground, held a distinct pattern, as if a rectangular shape had been slid across, probably a small cloth or something similar to hold all the utensils for the ritual. This is what happened when it was picked up. Naruto gestured a bit closer to them. That's where our criminal knelt. I would guess a man, maybe a tall woman, from the length of the shin. The marks in the dust were faint, but Griselda was able to follow his explanation. They were wearing a robe of some kind, maybe some kind of church vestments, which makes an insider likely when we include the ritual, but there are other clues. Gesturing around him, he tapped his nose and asked, you smell that? Griselda took a few whiffs but still looked confused. What am I supposed to smell exactly? She asked after a moment. Incense, Naruto pointed out. Incense? It's a chapel. Griselda countered reasonably. It is, Naruto nodded in acknowledgement and pointed above them, but up there and not down here. Unless this room is also used to hold Sunday's mass, it shouldn't be that strong down here. No, this is recent and from here. His nose worked far better than any human's, he could tell the difference. In addition, there is this. Picking up a small white morsel from the ground, he showed it to Griselda. After a moment, she seemed to realize what it was she was looking at. Is that frankincense? She asked. Yes, a small piece left from when the rest was used, most likely in the necessary ritual. Most importantly, it's the exact kind the Catholic Church uses for its incense. Most people don't know where to get this exact type, and of those that do, few have the means or reason to actually acquire it. Lastly, there is some small bits of ash scattered around, likely from the burning incense. That's all I can find here, but together with everything else it paints a pretty clear picture. Eyes narrowed and tone grim, it was obvious he wasn't happy about his own conclusions. So? Griselda asked, her eyes similarly narrowed and her posture braced for the impact of what he was about to say. From everything I have found, the person that did this knew exactly what they were looking for, knew the necessary ritual to enter, is likely still or was at least formerly associated with the Catholic Church, and was able to obtain, hide, and likely extract a holy weapon of the highest order without notice of the Vatican. Definitely an insider. Judging by the frown Griselda now sported, she had a suspect in mind. Think of someone? Naruto asked, one eyebrow raised in curiosity. Holy swords, church affiliation, and possibly dangerous interests. There is one person that fits the bill perfectly. Valper Galilei. Griselda almost spat the name, venom in her voice. Clearly there was no love lost between them. I've heard that name before, wasn't he kicked out some years ago, something about experiments? The two of them started towards the exit, since there was no point in remaining down here. Griselda nodded, frown still present. He was excommunicated years ago, after the extent of his experiments was revealed. A brilliant mind by all accounts, and his experiments did bear fruit eventually, but the cost was simply unacceptable. A good fit then. You should still launch an investigation into the cardinals and their associates. Even if we're looking for Valper, it's likely he wasn't working alone. You'll need to look into all the people even marginally involved. Naruto shouldered the heavy stone door open, finally giving them access to some clean air. There were no windows anywhere down there, a security measure meant to deny any access points beside the main doors, but it also meant that the air wasn't particularly fresh. As they neared the entrance to the chapel, there was something else bothering him. If Valper was their man, what was his reason? Steal an Excalibur from the Vatican. He might as well sign his death wish. And if he intended to do it, why be so sloppy about it? Leaving the door open. The theft likely wouldn't have been discovered for months if he had simply closed the vault again. Even if he hadn't been called in, a full investigation by Griselda would have come to the same conclusion eventually. Maybe she wouldn't have found all the clues, but the most obvious ones all pointed in his direction. Griselda was similarly lost in thought, barely sparing the two rogue guards a glance as they passed them at the entrance. Only giving them a distracted wave to indicate they could take up their posts again. Blood, small amounts. Further away, even more. Only now noticeable without focusing on it once he got some fresh air. The smell invaded his nostrils, punching through any thought process he had. Likely from the original guards. Probably both dead by now. The steps behind them were light and not getting further away, but closing on them instead. Ambush. 5 steps away. 1 chakra-infused breath in. His senses sharpened even further beyond human limits, muscles gaining power, giving him strength and speed closer to what he normally used. Suffusing his whole body with chakra completely would take a bit longer. This was a rush job, but more than enough for the situation. In the past the sounds and smells had overwhelmed him, but after a few centuries he had gotten used to them. Most of the information was useless and promptly ignored. But not all of it. Human, both of them. Deepened breathing, quickened but not hasty professionals, maybe rogue exorcists. Heart rates only slightly elevated. Another source further away, very faint barely perceivable breaths, heartbeat weakening every moment. One of the original guards, still clinging to life. The most minuscule traces of light energy light weapons, older models. With the newest ones even he had to be in sage mode to detect the additional energy they emitted. One came towards him, the other behind Griselda. Either they didn't know who he was or they were banking on surprise bridging the gap. Definitely lacking information if they believed that was good. That meant the light weapons weren't chosen specifically against him, but for either comfort, availability, or simply effectiveness. Likely some combination of all three. If they didn't use any light guns that meant a low likelihood of silver. Good for him, though it would make no difference for Griselda. 4 steps. He couldn't sense anyone else in the immediate vicinity, but with tall buildings and a good pair of lenses, you didn't need to be close. Possibly snipers further away. They were acting like they were going up against 2 humans even if strong ones, which meant they didn't know what he could do. Better keep it that way. Griselda hadn't noticed anything yet, still lost in thought. If there were snipers they would aim for her first. He was an outsider with unknown capabilities. If he hadn't been called in she would have been alone, so she was their target. 3 steps. Eyeing the distant rooftops he searched for any signs of ranged backup. 2 side-by-side bumps, a bit more than a kilometer away. Definitely snipers. No others. Difficult distance to act on for him. He'd need a few seconds to cross that, which would leave Griselda exposed. She had tensed slightly, noticing that something was wrong. Good. Griselda may not see as much combat as lower-ranked exorcists anymore, but her instincts were still razor-sharp. If their assailants were as professional as he suspected then the men behind them were just assurance. If the bullet did not kill Griselda, a slit throat certainly would. The bullet would arrive first. He could block it, but Griselda most likely hadn't noticed the snipers yet, still focused on the immediate threat. Naruto would need to act first. He usually preferred a different approach, but sometimes offense really was the best defense. The projectile would cross that distance in less than 1 second. Surprise would give him maybe 2 seconds total. 2 steps. Naruto spun on his heel. Snatching the hand extended towards his back by the wrist he squeezed, crushing bones as easily as he would snap a twig. The fist from below broke the arm, the weapon held in that hand started falling as he pulled the man by the broken wrist. A knee to the groin folded him over and cracked the pelvic bone. His hand edge moved towards the neck for the kill. Griselda will kill her attacker, keep this one alive Naruto thought suddenly. Instead of breaking the neck with a strike he gripped it from behind for an instant. Lightning chakra knocked the man out. Keeping him like that for long wasn't safe, but for now he needed his hands free. Dropping him Naruto spun around the other way, towards Griselda, who had just introduced a knife to her attacker's neck and extended a hand in front of her just in time. The projectile met his chakra-infused hand at the height of Griselda's brain. As soon as it had entered his range he had been able to sense the holy energies infused within, heightening its potency. Fortunately, it really was a normal bullet. The shooter had likely done a quick infusion just before shooting. He let his hand move with the projectile, reducing the damage. Bang. The sound reached them slower than the bullet. Even with a considerable amount of chakra strengthening bones, skin, and cartilage, he could still feel small bones in his hand fracture, the light energy serving to weaken his natural toughness slightly. That would hurt for a bit. A moment later the momentum of the bullet was completely arrested. Next to him the weapon used to attack him clattered to the ground just as its former wielder collapsed in a pile. He could hear the gurgling breaths of the other attacker that spoke of a cut windpipe. If he had learned anything about Griselda, jugular vein and carotid were similarly damaged. The man would be dead in seconds. He caught the next projectile the same way. This time there was enough time to sufficiently strengthen his hand before the impact. The light energy burned him slightly after tapping into his own inhuman nature to better protect himself from this one, but the bullet itself was ineffective. Bang! He could hear Griselda turn towards him, accompanied by the wet sound of a body hitting the floor, felt her eyes move from his back to his hand, still extended in front of her. A drop of blood dripped from his closed fist, the only sign of the damage he had sustained. One of the guards is still alive. Naruto barked out, his voice rougher than before. He was still focused on the distant threat but heard Griselda rush of, searching for the living guard in an effort to save his life. He slowly backed away at the same time. Griselda was smaller than him so protecting her was still possible from some distance away and it didn't take long for her to leave line of sight. Immediately, the two bumps started moving, abandoning their position on the rooftop in the distance. For a moment he debated pursuing but decided against it. Picking up the knocked out attacker he moved towards Griselda, body slung over his shoulder, snatching up the dropped weapon as well. They could get information out of this one, there was no reason to go after the other two, silencing them had little to no purpose and he may be able to help Griselda save the guard. Letting the smell of blood lead him he turned two corners before finding them. Griselda knelt at the man's side, one hand pressuring the wound in his chest, where a large red spot decorated the robes, and the other raised before her in prayer, while she chanted in Latin. Slowly, a golden light grew where her hand rested on the wound. Dumping the body and weapon to the side he spared the other guard a glance. The crumbled body was in the corner, a similar red spot on the robes. A stab to the heart from under the arm, slid right between the ribs. Channeling some chakra, frost bloomed between the knocked out attacker's hands and feet respectively, binding left to right. Should he wake up suddenly he'd be no threat. Hurrying over, hands already surrounded by a green glow, Naruto joined Griselda on the other side of the guard. One hand next to the wound he worked around Griselda, inspecting the damage inflicted on the heart, while his other hand moved to the head, testing breath and responsiveness. His talents in healing were still rather limited overall, but physical wounds were one of the few things he could take care of. Sicknesses and poisons presented a different issue, though neither was likely here. The man was still breathing quick shallow breaths, his pulse quick but weak. The damage to the heart was extensive, not enough blood moving with each pump. Naruto started working on the damage, knitting together the wound cell by cell. It was a slow process, this kind of healing had never been his forte. After another 8 verses Griselda stopped chanting, sweat beading her brow, the light slowly dimming. Their patient's healing accelerated considerably. With each moment the breaths came easier and Naruto could feel the heart starting to work better and better as damage was repaired at an astonishing rate. All in all it still took another minute before all the damage to the heart was healed, the other injuries slowly healing under Naruto's watchful eyes and green glowing hands. Griselda had fallen on her back, clearly exhausted by the ritual she had performed. His breathing's good and his heart is fully repaired. It will hurt like a bitch for at least a few days, but he should be fine otherwise, Naruto stated, hand still near the wound, green glow still present. I'm glad, Griselda said, voice quiet and shoulders slumped. Seeing her state and glancing at their surroundings, Naruto finished up. The wound was scabbed over, still raw and red all around, but the man would live. The green chakra disappeared from around his hands as he stood up. Eyeing the corpse, the two unconscious men, and Griselda, he asked her while picking up the injured guard, uncaring of the blood, can you stand or do I need to carry you? He had never used the kind of healing rituals the church had access to, and if they all had these kind of costs, he'd rather stick to his own ways. Griselda was an experienced and powerful exorcist, and one ritual had exhausted her in this way. Admittedly, the damage had been substantial. Without her efforts it would have been difficult for him to heal it all in time. Griselda straightened at his question, standing up on shaky legs. I'll be fine in a few minutes. It's not true exhaustion, but I'm not particularly suited for these kinds of rituals. Using it magically strains the body more than most things do, she explained slowly, her voice noticeably gaining strength after every word. Accepting her words, the guard balanced on his shoulder, Naruto moved towards the unconscious rogue. Snatching the man up by the back of his robe, he balanced him on his other shoulder. Leaning slightly to one side so that he did not drop the body he was not holding on to, Naruto extended a hand towards Griselda. At her momentarily confused look he sported a small grin. I'm not having you walk all the way back. After she put her own hand in his, Naruto channeled his chakra for a shunshin. They disappeared in a swirl of wind. A stop at the infirmary later they ended up in front of a closed door, office of one Vasco Strada. Griselda knocked once, which was immediately answered by an enthusiastic, come in. From inside. They both entered, Vasco rising from his chair to meet them. He quickly lost his smile after taking a look at them. The aged exorcist still had good instincts, sobering at their expressions and immediately noting both Griselda's remaining exhaustion and the blood still decorating their clothes. "You were met with some trouble, I take it." "You could call it that," Naruto said, a little humor working its way into his voice as he closed the door behind them. Griselda had already taken a seat, still a bit worn out. They had only dropped off the 2 guards at the infirmary, calling for a squad to head out and clear the scene before heading here. Leaning back against the door he explained. "Our search was fruitful. We've got a suspect, but we met some resistance in trying to return. Assassination attempt, Griselda was the target, they didn't know I would be there. 4 attackers in total. 1 dead, 1 in custody, the other 2 escaped. Rogue exorcists, most likely." Fishing out the weapon that had been wielded against him he put it on the table. "They were using these older models, but they were experienced. This runs deeper than just a break-in. I take it neither of you were hurt." Vasco sounded faintly worried, his concern mainly for Griselda. Not surprising, Vasco had a better idea of his capabilities than even Griselda did. "Not a scratch on us." Palms facing outward he presented his hands, only unblemished skin visible. Griselda looked on in interest for a moment before seemingly deciding that she didn't really care. "What are we dealing with then?" Vasco asked both of them. Exchanging a look with Griselda, Naruto indicated for her begin. "From what we found at the vault, we are definitely looking for someone with church affiliation. Somehow they got access to the necessary ritual, it was used to open the vault. From what we know at the moment I suspect Valper Galilei is somehow involved." Vasco's expression now matched Griselda's from earlier, similar dislike coloring his features. "That is indeed a very real possibility. You can probably confirm it when you interrogate the attacker. But there is still something bothering me about this." "What's the motive?" Naruto said, one hand raised to his chin. "What's the motive?" Vasco echoed. "Surely to steal Excalibur rapidly." Valper's obsession with all holy swords was well known even while he was still part of the church. "I would normally agree, but some things don't add up if that is the case." Griselda had straightened at his comment, obviously interested in what he had to say. Vasco only fixed him with a patient look, waiting for him to explain. "Let's go with the assumption that our suspicion is correct. Valper Galilei was involved with holy swords for years and had not only a known interest, but a known obsession with them. He would know where the Excalibur was stored, maybe even learned about a ritual being used for the vault while researching the weapon. Let's make it a truly wild story and say he even found out what the exact ritual is." He could see their thoughts following along as he talked, both of them careful not to miss any details. Valper goes in, maybe he bribes the guards, maybe he had inside contacts, uses the ritual and opens the vault. He is exactly where he wants to be. He takes Excalibur rapidly. He only needs to get away unnoticed, he could even use it to do so. I would assume someone like him has found a way to use a holy sword's power, natural-born wielder or not. So what does he do? He takes the sword and leaves just like that, open vault visible for everyone. If he had closed the door behind himself, you would have known about the theft in few months at the earliest. At that point, even I wouldn't be able to find much of anything. Valper, who is by all accounts a brilliant mind, did this to obtain a holy sword. That may be the least thought out, worst executed plan I have ever seen. No. This was not about acquiring a holy sword, or at least not entirely. Whoever did this knew you would find out immediately, wanted you to find out immediately. Now their expression were appropriately grim. Understandable really, what he was proposing meant something much larger was currently happening, all without their knowledge. All that said, there are 2 possibilities. Either obsession won out against reason, and the clues are pointing in the right direction, or someone wants you to think that Valper is the culprit, thereby leading you in the completely wrong direction. There was of course a third possibility, unspoken yet heard by all 3. That Valper Galilei really was as brilliant as they said, and that the doubt they now faced was part of the plan. It's irrelevant. As it stands our clues point us to Valper. If further investigations show other possibilities we'll change course, Griselda said. She seemed to have gotten over her exhaustion, though her reserves were still rather low. Naruto started smirking, he had been thinking the same thing. I agree with Griselda, Vasco said in answer, nodding his head. "I'll make some inquiries, hopefully someone knows Valper's current location. Would you help take care of our newest visitor Griselda?" At her nod Vasco turned to him. "Where do you believe your expertise would be applied best?" Thinking for a moment Naruto answered. "Not sure I'd be of much use in getting that information, I'm confident Griselda will be fully capable of that. I'll still tap some of my contacts, but there is another thing." Looking at the ceiling for a moment as he thought about the idea he had gotten, he could feel their eyes on him. "Can you get me access to your other Excalibur?" Naruto asked eventually. "Difficult, but not impossible." "What do you intend?" Vasco answered after a moment. The elderly priest spent a moment stroking his white whiskers in thought. The movement looked somewhat comical with the hulking physique he maintained despite his advanced age. As far as I know, the different Excaliburs are still connected. If I have one to work off of, I may be able to get a rough location if it's not in another realm. Fine-tuning the seal will take a while, but it shouldn't take more than 3 days. Depends on how soon you can get me access. I'll get on that immediately, Vasco said, already reaching for the phone on his desk. Griselda stood up and Naruto stopped, leaning against the door, both turning to leave. Before Vasco could start calling anyone, his phone rang. The two of them stopped in their tracks. Picking up the receiver, Vasco answered the phone. Vasco, Strada. Naruto resisted the urge to listen in, out of respect for Vasco if nothing else. He had a right to his secrets. If it was relevant to the current issue, Vasco would share it with them. Understood. Thank you, Vasco said, ending the call. He looked even more grim than he had when their suspicion of Valper's involvement had been mentioned. Meeting their expectant looks, he explained. That was a colleague from England. One of their Excalibur fragments was stolen. 2 days ago. I'll get on that seal immediately, I'll be ready in 48 hours. As one, all three of them rushed to get their parts done. Naruto and Griselda left the room, Vasco already contacting different people. What do you need beside the fragment? She asked. A room, preferably empty, a bit of silver, 5 grams at most, and a map of the world and some paper. I'll have to draw out the seal in full to test it before I start, he answered. They were moving at a brisk pace in the direction of the infirmary, people moving out of their path as soon as they saw them. Exorcists were relatively rare and tended to spend most of their time amongst themselves. They all knew each other. Griselda quartered on what looked like a warpath. People cleared the way out of self-preservation as much as good sense. I'll get you what you need. As they moved, Naruto had an increasingly difficult time ignoring the gut feeling he had felt developing ever since he had taken a look at the vault. Something was on the horizon, something painfully familiar. It had been a few decades, but he had spent millennia in this world already. This instinct had been put to frequent use in that time. Or, maybe not this week or month. Maybe not even this year. But soon. He had spent all of his life fighting, he was no stranger to war. It was almost nostalgic. He felt some apprehension at the thought too, but underneath it all, he felt excitement building up. It may be alien to most modern humans, but that feeling was much more common among the supernatural. The inherent threat to life, being truly faced with your own mortality and embracing that threat. Staring death in the face and escaping its grasp again and again. Few things served to get his blood pumping as much as a potentially lethal battle. As rare as that occurrence had become, it was time to start preparing in earnest. One last stroke and the circle was finished, completing the seal. Standing back to inspect it from further away, Naruto carefully went over every line. Covering such a large area required a monumental amount of chakra. If the seal was flawed or incomplete, all of that chakra would be discharged violently. Even though he had been working for the last 48 hours straight, he wasn't truly exhausted yet. His body was still fresh, figuring out and testing a seal was purely mental work, and even that would need a bit longer to truly get to him. Satisfied with his work, he walked to the side, careful to avoid the lines of ink. After washing out his brush in a small water dish, Naruto sealed it away, that part of the process complete. The door to the room opened slowly after a quiet knock. He had felt the 2 people arrive outside moments ago. One was Griselda, the other he did not know. Female, young, maybe late teens. Human. A swordswoman judging by her footsteps. Quite large reserves for one her age. Then there was the item in their possession. Well, really the 2 items. Both exceptionally holy. One openly carried, the more powerful one muted. Sealed away in somehow. Perfect timing, I just finished, Naruto said, turning towards them. The 2 fully opened the door and stepped inside, now that they were sure they weren't disrupting his concentration. He greeted Griselda with a nod, his focus shifting to her companion after she responded in kind. The young girl at her side frowned at both him and the room, a wide golden sheath bound in white cloth held in one hand, the sword inside obviously the Excalibur fragment. Allow me to introduce my student, Zenobia Kuoh, Griselda said, motioning towards the girl at her side. Kuoh, eh? Naruto gave Griselda a quick glance. Well, it's nice to meet you, Zenobia. You can call me Naruto, he continued, extending a hand towards her. Zenobia gave him a guarded look before her hand met his own for a handshake. She seemed wary of him, so either her instincts were unusually sharp for a human or Griselda had informed her of what she was dealing with, at least as much as Griselda knew. Nice to meet you too, Zenobia said, retracting her hand. Let's begin then. Carefully stepping over the lines of ink, Naruto stopped in an empty circle, just big enough for him to kneel in. Would you place Excalibur Destruction in there? He knelt down, indicating the oval in front of him. Unsheathed, he added, when Zenobia made to place the weapon down in its current state. As Zenobia started removing the cloth bound around the weapon, Naruto channeled some of his chakra. Not a large amount yet, that would come in a bit, but the others in the room could still feel the air grow heavy for a moment, a blue outline momentarily visible around him, before most of the seal was illuminated in a soft blue glow. One part to the right remained unaffected, as did 7 small circles arrayed in front of him. Griselda watched from the side, showing no outward reaction to what was happening. The white cloth being unwound from the sword revealed the long grip, easily long enough to fit 2 hands, and the 2 axe-like protrusions on the outside of the guard. The simple gold and brown sheath was the next to go, the wide blade audibly exiting its confinement, as if the blade itself was making its presence known. Zenobia stepped into the seal, avoiding the lines. Before she released her grip on the weapon, she looked back at Griselda for confirmation. She clearly didn't trust him. Griselda signaled for her to go ahead, and Zenobia put down Excalibur Destruction. The sword was positioned in an otherwise empty oval, connected by a single straight line to the circle that Naruto was in. Another line at the top connected the rest of the seal to the oval. After Zenobia had stepped outside the seal, joining Griselda on the side, Naruto took a few deep breaths. Channeling chakra had become second nature when he had been a teenager, channeling this much of it was the real problem. His reserves could cover it multiple times over, but accruing so much power so quickly was much harder with chakra than with the magical energy most creatures in this world used. On a breath out he began. The blue outline was back, now more visible and thicker than before. Otherwise nothing visibly changed in the room, though both Griselda and Zenobia felt the air grow heavy again. For a few seconds they had to strain to remain upright, breathing becoming suddenly more strenuous. When Naruto judged the amount of power to be sufficient, he released the ram seal his hands had been forming, the chakra he had accumulated flowing into the ink on the ground. Bit by bit the room returned to normal, the seal now glowing much brighter. One hand hovered over the ink near him, checking the stability of the seal and the flow of chakra, the other reached towards the grip of Excalibur Destruction. Technically he was no natural wielder, but he had made an interesting observation centuries ago. His hand closed around the grip, a trickle of his own magical energy moving with the contact. He did not have the aptitude of a natural-born wielder of holy weapons, but they did not reject him from wielding them. Activating any of their powers was usually beyond him, but for this it was enough. HRK. The smallest golden shimmer traveled along the weapon, illuminating it slightly against the gray flooring. He ignored the surprised noise from Zenobia. Griselda would handle it, even if she had never seen him do this either. He needed his concentration for the next part. The amount of chakra contained in the seal was enough to possibly level the building they were in, and even if it wasn't sufficient for that, Griselda and Zenobia would be hard-pressed to survive in any case. Slowly he moved his chakra to part of the seal on his right, specifically designed to hold all of it. The process was like filling a container to the very top. Quickly at first but slowing down more and more as it started reaching its limit. A few seconds later the container was filled to the brim. Focusing once more he triggered the first function of this seal. All of the chakra was immediately put to use. An invisible wave of chakra moved outwards in all directions. Had Griselda and Zenobia not felt his chakra just moments before, they likely wouldn't have paid it any mind. Unbeknownst to them, the wave traveled for many kilometers, blanketing an enormous area in a minuscule amount of his chakra. When all of the chakra he had infused into the seal the second time around had been used, he relaxed slightly, the blue glow of his chakra dulling in the seal. That was the potentially dangerous part done. The next part wasn't dangerous but certainly tricky. Even with one of the Excalibur fragments as a template, what he was trying to do wasn't exactly simple. Locating separate objects over such vast distances, even if they were closely related, was no easy feat. This kind of sealing had been more Jiraiya's or his parents' speciality. When he had first learned Fuinjutsu, he had been exclusively focused on combat applications. That usually meant quick to apply, quick to activate, in the best cases hard to spot or sense, and immediately effective. Learning this kind of thing had taken him centuries in this world, most of that time spent supremely frustrated, but in the end he had learned. The 7 circles around the oval that contained Excalibur Destruction were inscribed with runes. Each one describing one of the fragments. Well, some approximation of their description at least. Humans may have named the fragments a certain way, but simply using that name to orient his seal didn't necessarily have to work. Which was why the circles contained broad descriptions. If the ones he had inked down served to be inaccurate or ineffective, then he'd have to alter them. Could you explain what exactly it is that you are doing? I will have to include it in my report so no one throws a fit later on. We had to cut a bit of red tape to get you access, Griselda said, the ghost of a grin on her face. Zenobia threw her mentor a surprised look. Well, I'm trying to locate your missing Excalibur fragment. For that I'm using this one. Naruto pointed towards Excalibur Destruction in conjunction with my seal, sort of like a compass. I've never had to locate an object in these circumstances over such a potentially big distance, so I can't guarantee how accurate my information will be. If the fragment is in another realm, I won't be able to locate it. How accurate are we talking? Depends on the distance really. I'll be able to give you a direction and an approximate distance. If it's still in Italy or close to it, I should be able to pinpoint it exactly, any kind of cloaking notwithstanding. Further away than that? Definitely country, maybe region. City if it's still relatively close. We'll have to do the rest from there. While he explained, Naruto focused on one of the 7 circles in front of him and extended one hand. The circle contained a rough translation of destruction. This one was mostly a test to see if the fragment would respond to itself appropriately. The small circle lit up with a small nudge of chakra, the runes inside illuminated by his chakra. The oval containing Excalibur destruction responded after a moment, changing from a dull blue glow to a clear white. Seeing that, he sported a small but satisfied smile. What's that mean? Zenobia asked from the side. Removing his hand from the circle, Naruto spared her a glance and saw her point at the same circle he had just activated. These, he gestured towards the runes inside, are Norse runes. They are a rough description of destruction. To simplify, this seal uses that description and Excalibur destruction to orient itself. All of the Excalibur fragments are connected at a base level, so by reaching for a certain part of the original through this fragment, I can get a feedback from the other fragments. Judging the distance is a matter of roughly comparing the intensity of the feedback. That feedback also tells us the direction. Zenobia looked interested, if still a bit wary, while Griselda similarly looked on in curiosity as he explained. So, why use Norse runes? Griselda asked. A reasonable question, after all every other part of the seal beside the 7 descriptions was exclusively made up of either simple lines or Japanese kanji. Well, what I use for my sealing, Fuinjutsu, isn't exactly the most common art anymore. Back when I learned to use it I focused on other areas than this. I mostly learned this kind of sealing by experimenting alone later on, so achieving this seal using only that is beyond me. But I did happen to meet someone that knew Norse runes quite well some time back. Eventually I combined the two so that I would be able to cover more applications. In a way he had been lucky. Not that meeting a Valkyrie was rare on a battlefield, but not all of them took to their task as Gondel had done. Her skill with magic and runes had surpassed her fellow Valkyries, almost earning her the name Brynhildr, and some of that knowledge had been passed on to him. Those months had been filled with fascination, interest and passion, though like all things they had eventually come to an end. You truly are a man of many talents, Griselda mused, surprisingly little humor in her voice. I've had a long time to acquire them all. Naruto focused on the second circle, if he needed to do any amount of adjusting the whole process would be slowed down, better to get it over with as quickly as possible. He repeated the process with the second circle, the seal responding after a moment. Instead of the whole oval lighting up only a small part was activated, the glow surrounding that point growing continually weaker the further away it was. Judging by the direction and distance I'd say England, since it's Excalibur ruler, that should be Cornwall, Naruto said after a bit of thought and a glance at the map spread out on the side. I thought Excalibur ruler was lost. Zenobia looked at her mentor quizzically. Well, it's been an open secret that the descendants of King Arthur still own a fragment of his blade, Griselda answered while making a small note. Naruto moved on to the next fragment. The one that was most important to the other two, the stolen Excalibur rapidly. The seal reacted as it did before, the lines glowing blue before the oval in the middle followed suit. However this time there seemed to be some difficulties. Unlike the 2 times before, the oval instead started glowing at multiple points along itself. The different spots were illuminated with differing intensity, but even with some ability to differentiate between them, figuring out which point corresponded with which fragment was impossible. Judging the distance based on the intensity of the reaction was similarly difficult because of this. The main takeaway for Naruto was something else. He focused on the glowing spots, more specifically their number. The whole oval was glowing slightly, likely a reaction to the fragments still positioned inside it, but beside that only 5 spots were illuminated. Certainly not conclusive evidence, but the most likely explanation for that was that one of the fragments was currently in a different realm. Whether that was the underworld or another one, he had no idea. I presume that means your description wasn't accurate enough? Griselda asked. She and Zenobia had come a bit closer, both focused on the reaction of the seal. That's what I would guess. Disengaging that part of the seal, he erased the runes contained in the 3rd circle. Instead of unsealing his brush, Naruto focused chakra to his index finger, a blue glow surrounding the tip. With swift strokes he wrote a new sequence of runes. Writing seals or runes like this was much quicker than using ink, chalk or any other physical medium, though there was some loss in power involved as well. The writing wouldn't hold for long, his chakra would eventually be dispersed without a physical conduit to contain it, but they would serve their purpose for now. 2 different descriptions later finally gave the results he had looked for. France? Naruto muttered to himself. What was that? Griselda asked from the side. Naruto turned towards her as the seal powered down once more, gauging distances in his mind. In France, probably somewhere near Orleans if my estimates are right. Can't guarantee that it will be there for long though. He watched as Griselda took out her phone and called a number. The person on the other end didn't take long to pick up. I want any personnel we have near Orleans to be on high alert. We believe that a Valper Galilei is currently somewhere in the area, likely in possession of a stolen artifact. Possibly with additional rogues as support. I'll be in the area by tomorrow. Griselda ended the call after a positive answer from the other side, her phone once more hidden in the folds of her habit. You know, I can take us there later today if you want. I have a teleport point set up in the area, Naruto threw in, Griselda and his peripherals, as his focus moved back to the seal, ready to continue. A good idea, but let's finish this first. Naruto only nodded, already activating the seal again, trying to locate the next fragment. We may just be able to throw a wrench in this plan after all. Don't try to leash the power so tightly, Shirin. Just try to let it flow. Hiroka tracked her sister's chakra as it moved through her body, pulling in her outstretched hand. Slowly more and more power accumulated, being shaped into a rough sphere as it exited her body. After a few seconds a blue sphere had appeared in Shirin's hand. The ball of energy wobbled slightly every few moments, as if the surface was going to break any second, clearly unstable. Try to propel it forward again, Kuroka said, her focus on the stability of the sphere. The thing didn't contain a lot of power, but having it suddenly destabilize in your palm still wasn't pleasant. Shirin turned her hand, palm facing a tree not too far away. A moment later the little ball moved forward, not much faster than a child throwing an actual ball. The impact, if you could even call it that, wasn't impressive, the energy contained in the sphere sizzling out as it traveled to its target. Kuroka took a moment to compare this result to the ones before. Definite improvement, even if it was slow going. Judging by Shirin's expression, hard as that tended to be, she didn't agree. Better, she finally said. But you are still trying to force your chakra to obey you. Shirin's expression didn't change, her gaze still stubbornly focused on the tree she had been aiming at. Her tail was much easier to read, flicking behind her in clear irritation. Even accomplishing that had taken a bit. Shirin had spent so long ignoring her nature that teaching her turned out much harder than Kuroka had anticipated. When she had first proposed her plan to teach her sister to Naruto, her expectation had been that all Shirin would require would be a demonstration of a new technique and then refinement and practice. Nekashu, like all yokai she knew of, learned mainly by instinct. There was some ingrained understanding in each of them what they could accomplish with their power and how they could accomplish it. Not that those ingrained instincts were the extent of their potential, but exceeding those boundaries involved a lot more trial and error and careful calibration. But it almost seemed like Shirin didn't have those instincts, or was at best unaware of them. Maybe she needed to try this a bit differently, needed to find some other way to teach this. A quick glance at the setting sun told her that they had been working on this for about 3 hours now. Her sister didn't show it, but she could sense that Shirin's chakra was reaching its limit. In the moment of inspiration Kuroka thought of a way that could work. One last one. This time try to, she waved her hand in a vague gesture, try to do what feels natural. In a surprising show of genuine emotion Shirin simply looked at her as if she was an idiot. Just ignore what you saw me do. Kuroka extended her hand, a blue ball forming and firing off in a fraction of a second. Her target, a tree at the edge of the clearing, now sported a hole through the middle, as did the tree behind it. Try to get the same result your own way. Shirin looked at the tree for a few seconds, the movements of her tail indicating careful thought. Finally she firmed her stance. Unlike before she drew 1 foot back, her stance wider but lower than the one Kuroka had used. Then she drew right arm back, as if to throw something. With the movement of her arm she gathered her chakra. Instead of a ball in her palm, the energy gathered around her whole hand. The chakra flickered with a life of its own, reminiscent of fire, though there was no accompanying heat. Then she threw. The orb of chakra was noticeably faster than before and more importantly didn't destabilize before reaching its target. The throw went a bit wide, only scuffing the side of the tree, but her bark still ruptured under the impact. She felt like a great fool now. Well done. Kuroka gave her sister a small smile, satisfied with their progress despite her own misgivings. Shirin did not immediately return the gesture. Their relationship still wasn't what she wished it to be, but Kuroka had already accepted that it would take time and effort. It hadn't been simple to decide what to teach her sister. Shirin was capable for her age, but she was still growing. Then there was the time limit to consider. Even if they did have all the hours in the remaining 4 days, that was still only 4 days. Senjutsu was too risky and unlikely to be a successful endeavor, all 3 of them had agreed on that. Shirin relied on hand-to-hand combat, her rook piece enhancing her natural capabilities in that direction. So there had been 2 basic options, either enhance her proficiency in that area further or give her some different options to broaden her arsenal of possible tactics. Specifically in giving her an option when fighting at range. Without Senjutsu the small balls of chakra weren't a big threat, but they could still do damage. Creating space, buying time, forcing a dodge or block, having a ranged option had many uses for her sister. That's enough for today, Shirin. We'll continue tomorrow at the same time. Keko. Shirin's voice was barely louder than a whisper. What was that? My name, it's Keko. Keko Taoju, Rook of Rias Gremory. Not Shirin. This time her sister spoke louder, each word firmer than the last. But Kuroka had to suppress the reflex to argue. She had imagined a good relationship with her sister for years, but getting there had been much easier in her mind. Instead she accepted, Keko then. Her sister turned to leave, ready to end the day of training. Thank you. Sure, Kaneko's voice was barely louder than before, but Kuroka still heard her without a problem this time. Maybe it wouldn't be that hard after all. Her sister left after that, headed to the house to get some rest. Tomorrow would bring the same exhausting mix of physical conditioning and magical training as today had done. There were only so many days left until the raiding game after all. Kuroka followed her with her eyes, remaining in the clearing for a bit more. You two ready? The two exorcists nodded. Both of them had changed into gear more appropriate for what they expected to encounter. They should only have to deal with some rogues at most, but it never hurt to be prepared. To exorcists it was basically second nature. Exorcists hunted unholy creatures of the night, vampires, werewolves, devils and the like. Since they were humans, anything that could grant them an advantage over their targets was exploited to its limits. Their weaknesses to silver, holy water or light energy, and numbers advantage to offset the higher base physical abilities of the supernatural, and centuries of knowledge on the behavior, strengths, weaknesses, and limits of those same creatures. Their gear was littered with items meant to allow combating such things. Holy water, light weapons, crosses, a Bible, silver bullets, silvered knives, not to mention special equipment depending on the exact targets. Wooden stakes and oil and flash paper for vampires, grenades filled with silver shrapnel for werewolves and many other things. Naruto knew that Griselda also favored a thin, silvered chain armor underneath the standard issue black combat attire. Zenobia as her student very likely did something similar. He had also changed clothes, fighting in a suit wasn't something he did if he had other options. His clothing was similarly dark and he also wore a thin chain shirt underneath, but his gear was of the more mundane variety. Throwing knives, a few pouches filled with an assortment of useful equipment. Stun grenades, explosive tags, 2 spools of wire, a flashlight, zip ties. A combat knife and a handgun finished the ensemble. Most of it was comparatively useless against supernatural creatures, but he always had his chakra if necessary. Channeling his magical energy he activated the teleportation. The basic teleportation spell most supernatural creatures with some understanding of magic had access to was pretty simple. You needed either a person or a location that you had prepared beforehand, a bit of magical energy and the correct magic circle. Combine all three and you could teleport. He had keyed in the teleport point he had in France, when forming the magic circle all three of them were standing on now. In a flash the circle consumed them, their surroundings warping around them. A moment later they had changed locations. Naruto took in the familiar forest, well accustomed to arriving in this spot. It had been a few years since the last time he had been here, but he knew the place intimately. He gave the small, stone monument at the edge of the clearing a furtive glance before turning to the other two. We're about 20 clicks outside Orleans. I can get us to the city in a few minutes, but I don't know where exactly Excalibur Rapidly is in this area or where your agents are stationed. If we mobilize all available forces we'll have about 40 exorcists in the area by tomorrow morning. With that number we should be able to examine all of the possible locations in the broader area by midnight that day, Griselda said, after a moment of thought. That would still be quite the task even with that personnel count, but certainly doable if they hurried. So, where to? To the cathedral first, we'll coordinate the rest from there, Griselda answered. Naruto held out his hands towards the two. Griselda readily accepted the hand, already aware of what he was about to do. Zenobia gave him a look that was equal parts confused and wary before watching Griselda. Seeing her mentor comply she did the same after one last considering glance in his direction. With a bit of chakra the three of them left the clearing as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing in a gust of wind. Not long after, they arrived at the top of the cathedral's spire, right in the middle of Orleans. Zenobia immediately scrambled to the edge, already clutching her stomach and mouth, and close to losing her last meal. The first unprepared shunshin had that effect on some people. Griselda handled the experience much better than her student, but this also hadn't been her first time. She gave their surroundings a quick once-over before inspecting the way down, while they waited for Zenobia to feel a bit better. It took a few moments and some last deep gulps of the fresh air before the young exorcist was able to go on. The three of them delved into the cathedral, Griselda leading them from the front. The outer robe she and Zenobia wore over their combat gear, clearly identifying them as members of the church, serving to open those doors that wouldn't open to outsiders. Their meeting with a local bishop, a retired exorcist, didn't take long. After some quick questions and explanation they all moved to a back room that had been prepared. The table inside held a map of the region, different churches and chapels already marked on the parchment. The young deacon was continuously checking different papers haphazardly strewn around the table and marking additional spots on the map when they entered. The bishop exchanged a few words with the younger man, but Naruto didn't pay them any mind. He was already focused on the map and its contents. Even with 40 additional personnel, the area was large. The exorcists would need to work in groups of at least 4 people, 6 if they could afford it. That meant they would have anywhere from 7 to 11 groups perusing the area, 12 if he worked alone. If they could look at some of the more obvious places today and cut down the numbers a bit, the chances that they would find Excalibur rapidly increased, but they were still low. There were already more than 100 spots marked on the map, and that number would only increase, judging by the stack of papers that Deacon had been working on. He had never used or even held Excalibur rapidly, so his own sensory abilities wouldn't work perfectly, but in Sage mode, he may still be able to pick up something. That would narrow down the area at least. But there was also some narrowing down they could do in other ways. A page of paper was suddenly blocking his view. Looking up, he could see Griselda extending the paper his way, her intent clear behind the stubborn look she was giving him. Zenobia was already working on another page next to her, dutifully marking locations. Sometimes she really does make you wonder. With a shake of his head, Naruto accepted the page and started working. Sometimes Griselda really did treat him like one of her unwilling juniors. We won't be able to cover the area till midnight tomorrow, even excluding the ones we already ruled out today. Griselda walked around the table, inspecting the map from differing angles, as if that would change the facts in front of her. He could see the spark of frustration in her mannerisms. There had been more potential hideouts than they had thought. Almost all of them were either old, smaller in complete disrepair, but rogues that wanted to avoid any attention would still have use for such places. The map now included around 300 marked locations. Not to mention the possibility that the actual hideout wasn't among the ones they knew about. Their chances of getting the sword back weren't looking particularly good. Exclude the outermost portion from the equation, how does that change things? Naruto chimed in from the other side of the table. They had divided the map into 3 roughly circular regions. Those spots in the outermost portion were the most problematic. By their very nature, the distance between spots was the biggest there, and unlike him, the exorcists were more restricted in crossing vast distances quickly. They would travel by car or on foot depending on the assigned targets, and that would take a lot of time with a number of spots. There was also the likelihood of each location to consider. Their targets knew they were being chased, or at least that the church would be looking for them very soon, but shouldn't yet know just how close they were. The innermost ring of the 3 was the most unlikely to actually contain the real hideout. With their proximity to Orleans, all those hideouts had been the first they had considered, without any result so far. Alper, or whoever was in charge on the other side, would have been aware that any effort on the church's part in this region of France would start in Orleans. They had still started there nonetheless, overlooking Excalibur rapidly, because they had judged the chance to be low would be disastrous. The outermost portion, on the other hand, was also unlikely, though less so. First, his own judgment of the location put the fragment closer to Orleans than those hideouts were. Second, the thieves needed the ability to move quickly. With a hideout in the outermost portion, reacting to enemy forces coming from outside the region was very difficult. They likely also wanted to move countries as soon as possible. That meant driving or flying if they didn't have access to teleportation. Flying forced their hand towards Paris in the north or towards Tours in the west. Driving wasn't as restrictive, but with a hideout closer to the center, the options for destinations were more numerous. Fortunately, he had already acted. Griselda gave him an asking glance before considering the information. That would make the task more manageable. We could possibly cover all locations until late tomorrow. What did you do? She eventually asked. He shrugged his shoulders before answering her question. I sent out a few clones some time ago. I had them start with the spots that were the furthest away. I've updated them on the complete version so we can exclude that part of the map. But I may be able to cut the number down even further. He walked up to the table while inspecting the map. The marked spots obviously clustered around settlements, though some safe houses and hideouts were more remote. If he really stretched himself while in Sage mode, his maximum sensory range was about 25 kilometers for something like this. However, the results got worse the further away something was in that range. His effective range was much closer to 10 kilometers in Sage mode. The accuracy would be necessary if he wanted a chance of narrowing down the location of Excalibur rapidly. He hadn't tried sensing a sealed-off Excalibur fragment in Sage mode before, but it should be possible. I may be able to narrow the location to a 20-click radius. I'm not guaranteeing anything though, I've never worked with this exact situation. If Excalibur rapidly is completely dormant and harshly sealed off, I may not pick up anything. He was already going over the most efficient route in his head as he answered. The problem was of course that he wouldn't necessarily know if the problem was that he was unable to sense Excalibur rapidly. There was the possibility that they were too late. Even if he had the ability to perceive the fragment in its current state, if it wasn't in the area anymore, he couldn't be sure which was the case. It's a good idea to try regardless. I'll have the teams work outward from here. Hopefully we'll be able to locate it quickly that way, Griselda said, her eyes still focused on the map. Do you want the thieves alive? Or just the fragment back? He asked. Griselda looked up for a moment, clearly thinking about the answer. Griselda was the one in command on this mission, her experience and ability rarely being matched among exorcists, Vasco being one of the notable exceptions. Keep them alive if possible. This whole thing is obviously even deeper than we suspect. I wouldn't doubt that there is still some players involved that we know nothing about. Not to mention the other fragments that have been stolen, she said eventually. They had gotten word about a third fragment going missing a couple of hours ago. That meant the Catholic, Protestant and Orthodox Church had all lost one of the fragments in their keeping now. One holy sword was bad enough in the wrong hands, even if these were only fragments of one, but three. Personally he was more worried about Nightmare and Transparency than he was Rapidly, but that didn't change the fact any holy sword was dangerous. Enhanced speed was certainly helpful to anyone, and the danger the wielder presented was definitely serious among humans, but speed could be worked around relatively easily. Invisibility was dangerous but depended largely on the wielder. If you couldn't move silently, hide your scent, and avoid encountering hazards like rain or attacks that covered a large area, invisibility was worse than useless. The weapon being invisible was helpful, especially if your opponent had never seen its dimensions before, but even that had its limitations. The illusory powers of Excalibur Nightmare were the most problematic of the three. Manipulating dreams was rather limited in its use, since the ability was limited in range, but illusions of any kind, if they were crafted well, were dangerous. His own abilities in using Genjutsu were rather lacking, only the simpler illusions bending to his will, but even those could ascertain victory. Spotting Genjutsu, on the other hand, he had become much better at. His enhanced senses, partly a byproduct of being the jailer of the Kyuubi from birth, had helped massively in that regard. If the one casting the illusion did not account for the sensory information their target was accustomed to, spotting the illusion was made much easier. In Yuzuka, Aburam, Hyuga, Uchiha and even Nara to a lesser extent. All of those clans had been a pain for any opposing Genjutsu specialist. Accounting for an additional sensory dimension or just a much broader sensory range was incredibly difficult without your own senses having similar features. Konoha had been very powerful in that regard. Like most things, the right application was important. Spotting illusions created by chakra had been difficult enough if a master was at work, and breaking them could be even trickier. There was a good reason that Genjutsu users tended to be the first targets in the field. Wide-ranging illusions had won entire battles in the history of the elemental nations. However, Excalibur Nightmare functioned differently. He had never dealt with its ability to manipulate dreams personally, but he had been on the receiving end of one of its illusions once. Unlike Genjutsu, which were usually applied to a target person, Excalibur Nightmare's illusions were applied to a location. While detecting them was normally simple enough, dispelling them was a different matter. Dispelling Genjutsu worked by disrupting your own chakra flow, breaking the enemy's control over it, thereby dispelling the illusion. Dispelling the illusions that Excalibur Nightmare could create was, as far as he knew, only possible by disrupting the wielder's concentration, which was usually made more difficult because of those illusions. That meant you had to find and catch the wielder first. Holy swords were a pain to deal with. How good are the others? Naruto asked after a bit. Griselda had continued observing the map, seemingly looking for some kind of pattern they could be missing. She sighed deeply, rolling her shoulders as she relaxed her stance before answering him. Most of them are well trained, though young and relatively inexperienced. We've got a few older, more experienced squad leaders, with dozens of successful missions under their belts, and I'm confident that they will be able to lead their squads well, Griselda answered. Naruto considered her and her answer for a moment before moving on. Zenovia. She is talented, resourceful, and has sharp instincts. Admittedly she is young and can be a bit rash, but she is more than ready for a mission of this caliber. Griselda couldn't quite hide the affection from her expression, even if he knew better than to mention it. He would only be threatened with bodily harm if he did. She wields Durandal, doesn't she? Naruto asked, confident in his assessment. When he had sensed the object on her the first time he hadn't been sure, but after being around her for a bit longer the picture became pretty clear. She also reminded him of a young Vasco Strada. Griselda only nodded, her surprise at his knowledge evident in her widened eyes. He couldn't quite keep a small grin at bay at the sight. How good is she with it? Vasco had been particularly suited to the weapon, mastering its use in his 20s. That, in addition to Vasco's freakish physical abilities, had made him extremely dangerous even among the supernatural. She was chosen by the weapon, and her compatibility is high, though she is still struggling to master its use. Her swordplay is excellent. So far her abilities have never failed her, and I'm confident they won't do so here either. Excluding me, she is the most powerful exorcist we have here, Griselda provided. Naruto understood immediately. Griselda wasn't one for unfounded boasting, and her analytical abilities were one of her greatest strengths, but power only got you so far. Experience and skill could easily overcome superior power in a contest between the two. That was one of the main ways exorcists triumphed over their targets. Rage and teeth and claws were often a poor match against swordplayer marksmanship. Well, nothing we can do about that now, he finally said. Griselda nodded before attempting to stifle a yawn. Griselda, just like him, had not slept more than a few minutes in the last 48 hours. Naruto circled the desk and laid a hand on her shoulder, stirring her away from the table and out of the room. Come on, we should both get some sleep. We won't be making any more progress today anyway. Griselda put up a token resistance at first before acquiescing to his words. They extinguished the lights before leaving the room and then the building. The rooms they had been given were located in an outbuilding. They walked through the dark in silence. After entering the other building and navigating 2 hallways, they both stopped in front of Griselda's room. Naruto looked at her in interest as she turned towards him. There were no lights in the vicinity, so only a bit of moonlight allowed Griselda any vision. Be honest with me, how high do you think our chances are? She said, quietly. Zenobia used the next room, where she was hopefully already asleep after Griselda had sent her to bed over an hour ago. Despite her obvious fatigue, Griselda's gaze was sharp and fixed on his face. At this distance she would be aware of any sign of deceit despite the darkness. We have a considerable advantage in speed and with it, surprise. Even if they know by tomorrow that we are close, there is a good chance that we'll be able to catch them before they can escape. If anything, putting that pressure on them may lead them to make mistakes. Even if we don't catch them and recover Excalibur rapidly, we should find the necessary clues to break this case wide open, he answered honestly. I'd wager that we are almost guaranteed to meet our thieves tomorrow. Griselda continued to muster him for a moment longer before her expression relaxed. Instead of saying anything, she only nodded and turned away to open her door. Taking that as his signal, Naruto moved towards his own room. He heard the door opening after a moment of walking, though no steps followed the sound. Naruto. Griselda's voice was no louder than before, but the night easily carried the words. He stopped walking and looked back. The darkness didn't hinder him. His night vision may not be as good as Kuroka's, but it did the job. Griselda was standing in the same place as before, the door now held ajar with one hand. Yes. Griselda hesitated for a moment. The monument, where we arrived. You built it, no. Naruto froze. He had thought that the other two had been unable to spot the small stone in the short time they had been in the clearing. Yes. I did, he admitted, declining to elaborate further. This was not a conversation he wanted to have in the middle of the night. If he was honest, it wasn't a conversation he ever wanted to have, not without copious amounts of alcohol at least. My condolences, she responded instead. Maybe Griselda hadn't read the inscription after all, only correctly assumed the importance of the little landmark. Whether she had been able to read it or not, he was grateful nonetheless. Thank you. He gave Griselda a small smile, despite the futility of the gesture in the darkness. She nodded once and entered her room, the door closing soon after. He stood in the hall for a bit longer, Griselda's words making him think about certain matters. Even if they had only interacted professionally, he liked to think that she was his friend, and his friends deserved to know the truth. One day, I'll tell you the story, Naruto decided for himself as he continued towards his room. His clones had finished the outermost region by noon. From there they moved inwards, checking more and more potential hideouts. Griselda and her teams had moved outwards from Orleans doing the same. Naruto spent his time differently. Instead of checking locations in person, he moved around in sage mode, focusing his senses to detect the tiniest speck of holy energy. Without the weapon being actively used, there wouldn't be a lot of it, and if the weapon was sealed, even less, so he needed to be thorough. The experience of being in sage mode was always interesting. It didn't actually change anything about his physical senses, though his ability to feel magical energies was considerably enhanced. He could hear and smell just as well outside of sage mode as he could while in sage mode, and yet there was still a noticeable difference. All the sensations that he experienced were suddenly more present, more immediate. Even if he could hear the leaves around him rustling in the wind without sage mode, he was more aware of that phenomenon like this. He didn't need to think about the sounds he perceived or interpret them. Even with his focus kilometers away, scouring the countryside for any sign of Excalibur rapidly, he was still conscious of all the things that happened in his immediate surroundings. Naruto did not often have any need to enter sage mode in this day and age. Not that the occasions had been particularly numerous before. Though with war on the horizon, if his instincts were correct at least, there was a distinct possibility of such an event occurring more commonly soon. One last sweep of the area and he was sure this one was clear too. He moved on. It was almost evening now and still there was no sign. They had almost searched 3/4 of the whole region and had found nothing yet. He had started in the north, working his way counterclockwise through the region. His clones had worked in the opposite direction, and so did Griselda and her teams. There was always the possibility that their targets moved from one hideout to another. Since the areas each group had been assigned overlapped slightly, they had a chance of spotting that. Naruto double-checked his location against the plan before sitting down and concentrating on the surroundings. Nothing obvious alerted his senses. Still, completely scanning areas of this size took a few minutes, so he continued. The current area was sparsely populated, mostly covered in forests, but that also meant that there were quite a few remote safehouses and hideouts scattered around. Old church ruins, rundown buildings, abandoned mineshafts, ramshackle huts. The church used many different locations to establish temporary hideouts for exorcists. Useful, especially when you had to stay on the move or just needed something close there. Slight, very slight. Holy energy, such a small amount he had almost overlooked it. Barely in his effective range. Focusing on the energy told him a bit more. The energy was muted, obviously sealed off in some way. No magical signatures of any note in the immediate surroundings, none that were muted either. There shouldn't be any surprises. Standing up he summoned a clone, immediately dispelled it and fished out his phone. His clones were aware of the finding now, particularly the one he had left back in Orleans overlooking the map. Yes. Found them. About 9 clicks northwest of point D7. My clone can give you precise directions. Want me to engage? Griselda was silent for a moment. Probably checking the positions of all current squads. That close but don't engage yet. I'll notify the others. 2 squads will be in the area within the hour. I want updates on their movements. I'll be there as soon as possible. I'll wait there. With that he ended the call. Putting his phone away he started moving. Time to get a look at those rogues.